Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The sound still wakes me, not the growl, though that haunts me too, but the deliberate tick-tick-tick of pebbles rolling down gravel, each one landing with surgical precision beside my boots. 3 stones, always 3, like a countdown I never learned to read. It started 6 weeks ago on Highway 287, that ribbon of asphalt that cuts through Montana's belly like a surgeon's incision. Jake and I were heading back from Billings, our pickup loaded with enough fence posts to patch the winter damage on my property line. The October sun hung low and orange, casting everything in that golden hour light that makes even roadkill look beautiful from a distance. That's when we saw the deer. It limped along the shoulder with an awkward 3-legged gait, favoring its left rear leg. Nothing unusual about an injured deer in hunting season, but something about this one made Jake ease off the accelerator. The animal moved with purpose, not the panicked stumbling of fresh trauma, but the careful, measured steps of something that had learned to live with pain. Jake suggested we check if it needed putting down, a mercy both of us had performed before. We pulled over, gravel crunching under the tires, and I reached for the rifle behind the seat. The deer stopped moving, not the usual freeze and assess behavior of startled wildlife, but a complete stillness that seemed almost aware. I had one foot on the running board when the sound came from the ravine below. The growl was short, barely 2 seconds, but it carried weight. Not the territorial warning of a black bear or the frustrated snarl of a mountain lion defending a kill. This sound had intelligence behind it, a deliberate quality that made the hair on my forearm stand rigid. Then came the breath, hot and humid against the cool October air, washing over us with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something that reminded me of wet concrete and old pennies. Jake's hand found my shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. We both stared at the ravine's edge, waiting for whatever had made that sound to show itself. The silence stretched until my ears began manufacturing their own sounds, phantom rustles in the brush, imaginary footsteps in the dead leaves. That's when the first stone rolled up. I watched it happen. A piece of granite no bigger than a marble detached itself from the loose scree at the ravine's lip and traveled uphill, defying gravity with casual indifference. It came to rest against my boot with a gentle tick. Jake's breath caught in his throat. We exchanged glances, each hoping the other had a rational explanation ready. The second stone followed 30 seconds later, taking the same impossible trajectory. Same size, same deliberate pace, same soft collision with leather and steel. By the time the third stone completed its journey, the deer had vanished into the tree line, and whatever had been watching us from the ravine had gone quiet. We left without investigating further. Jake made some comment about optical illusions and steep angles, his voice pitched higher than usual. I nodded and agreed, but neither of us believed it. Some things can't be explained away with geometry and wishful thinking. That should have been the end of it. I told myself it was over during the following week, repeated the mantra while fixing fence posts and checking cattle. Jake and I didn't discuss what we'd seen, maintaining the kind of willful silence that men use to contain things they can't understand. But the memory festered, growing heavier with each passing day. 7 days later, I found myself driving that same stretch of highway at dawn. Not intentionally, at least that's what I told myself. I'd been checking the north pasture for stragglers, and the shortest route home happened to take me past the ravine. Pure coincidence. The morning mist clung to the road like smoke from a dying fire, and visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards. I almost missed the spot where we'd stopped, but the distinctive bend in the guardrail caught my eye. I pulled over, telling myself I was just satisfying curiosity. The circle was waiting for me. 20 feet from the road's edge, the grass lay pressed flat, in a perfect ring, roughly 12 feet in diameter. The surrounding vegetation stood untouched, creating a boundary so precise it might have been drawn with a compass. No burn marks, no chemical damage, just grass laid down as if by an invisible hand. The pattern was too perfect for wind, too uniform for wildlife. I approached slowly, my boots squelching in the morning damp earth. That's when I saw the tracks. The paw print in the mud was massive, larger than any mountain lion I'd encountered in 30 years of Montana living. 4 toes, each terminating in a claw mark that suggested retractable weapons kept razor sharp. But it was the other marks that made my chest tighten. 4 parallel gouges scored the earth beside the paw print, each one perfectly straight and evenly spaced. They reminded me of the grooves left by desperate fingernails dragging across concrete, or the skid marks of something with claws trying to stop its forward momentum. The gouges were deep, carved with enough force to displace several pounds of packed earth. I knelt beside the marks, close enough to smell the rich, loamy scent of disturbed soil, close enough to notice that the gouges pointed directly toward the flattened grass circle, close enough to see that they were fresh, made within the last few hours, judging by the crisp edges and lack of weathering. Movement caught my peripheral vision. Something large shifted position in the tree line, perhaps 60 yards away. I couldn't make out details through the morning haze, but the motion was deliberate, controlled, not the random movement of wind-blown branches or foraging wildlife. This was something watching, evaluating, deciding. I stood up too quickly, sending a wave of dizziness through my skull. The forest had gone quiet. No bird songs, no insect chatter, no small mammals rustling through the underbrush. Just the whisper of mist moving through pine needles and my own ragged breathing. The drive home took twice as long as usual. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see something following the truck. Nothing materialized, but the sensation persisted. That feeling of being tracked by invisible eyes, studied like a specimen under glass. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle, interpreting every creak as approaching footsteps, every gust of wind as deliberate breathing. My dreams, when they came, were filled with amber eyes and the sound of claws on hardwood floors. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress from the divorce proceedings, too much coffee and not enough sleep, the natural human tendency to find patterns in random events. But rationality felt thin and inadequate when measured against the weight of what I'd experienced. I started avoiding Highway 287, taking the longer route through town whenever possible. But avoidance only amplified the obsession. The circle haunted my thoughts, growing larger and more significant with each passing day. I found myself researching crop circles, animal behavior, geological anomalies, anything that might provide a framework for understanding. The internet offered conspiracy theories and grainy photographs, testimonials from people who claimed similar experiences. Most were clearly fabricated or delusional, but a few carried the ring of truth that comes from genuine terror. Stories from Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, all involving circles of flattened vegetation, oversized paw prints, and the persistent feeling of being hunted. One account from a rancher near Glacier National Park mentioned stones rolling uphill. 3 stones, according to his testimony. Always 3. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening pasture. My cattle grazed peacefully, undisturbed by whatever forces might be moving through the landscape. But their behavior had changed subtly over the past few weeks. They clustered closer together, avoided the fence line that bordered the national forest, and showed signs of nervous agitation that hadn't been present before. Animals know things. They sense disturbances in the natural order long before humans acknowledge them. My cattle were trying to tell me something, but I lacked the vocabulary to understand their warnings. 3 weeks after finding the circle, I woke to silence, not the peaceful quiet of a Montana morning, but the oppressive absence of sound that comes when every living thing decides to hold its breath simultaneously. No wind in the pines, no creek water over stones, no cattle lowing in the distance. Just silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. I dressed quickly and stepped onto the front porch, rifle in hand. The air tasted metallic, charged with the same energy that precedes a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear, star-drunk and moonless. The barn door was open. I always secured it before bed, a habit ingrained by decades of livestock ownership. The heavy wooden door hung loose on its hinges, swaying slightly in air too still to generate any breeze. Something had opened it from the inside. My boots crunched through frost-brittle grass as I approached the barn, rifle ready but safety still engaged. The darkness inside was absolute, impenetrable even to eyes adjusted for night vision. I fumbled for the light switch, found it, flipped it up. Nothing happened. The power hadn't failed. The house lights were still on, casting yellow rectangles across the yard. But the barn remained dark, as if electricity refused to function within its walls. I pulled out my flashlight and thumbed the switch. The beam died after penetrating maybe 3 feet into the interior, swallowed by darkness that seemed almost solid. I could hear my cattle somewhere in the blackness, breathing heavily, but otherwise still. They were afraid to move, afraid to make noise, afraid to draw attention to themselves. Something else was in there with them. I knew it the way prey animals know they're being stalked, through some primitive awareness that predates conscious thought. The knowledge settled into my bones like winter cold, undeniable and absolute. Something large and patient was sharing space with my cattle, tolerating their presence while it focused on more interesting prey. Me, I backed away from the barn, keeping the rifle trained on the doorway while my flashlight performed its useless dance against the consuming darkness. The silence stretched, broken only by my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then I heard it, the deliberate tick-tick-tick of pebbles rolling across concrete. 3 stones emerged from the barn's darkness, moving with that same gravity-defying precision I'd witnessed on the highway. They traveled in single file, maintaining perfect spacing, and came to rest in a neat line beside my boots. The message was clear. I was being marked, claimed, cataloged for future reference. I spent the rest of the night in the house with every light blazing and the rifle across my lap. The cattle remained silent until dawn, when normal sounds gradually returned to the world. By full daylight, I found them huddled in the far corner of the barn, unharmed, but traumatized. Whatever had visited during the night had left no physical evidence of its presence, but the stones were still there, lined up beside the barn door like a calling card. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, the encounters have become more frequent, more personal. I find stones arranged in geometric patterns around my property. Triangles, pentagrams, spirals that hurt to look at directly. My cattle avoid certain areas of the pasture, creating invisible boundaries that correspond to no physical landmarks, and the watchers have multiplied. I see them now in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that dissolve when I turn to look directly. They follow me through the forest, pace my truck along remote roads, and gather outside my house after sunset. The amber eyes that haunt my dreams have started appearing during waking hours, visible for split seconds before vanishing into shadow. Jake came by yesterday, concerned about my appearance and behavior. I tried to explain what's been happening, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. He listened with the patient expression people use when dealing with the mentally unstable, made non-committal sounds, and suggested I see someone about the stress. Maybe he's right. Maybe the divorce, the isolation, the long Montana winters have finally cracked something fundamental in my mind. Maybe I'm manufacturing supernatural explanations for perfectly ordinary events, because the alternative, accepting that I'm losing my sanity, is too terrifying to contemplate. But the stones keep rolling uphill, and somewhere in the darkness beyond my windows, ancient things with amber eyes are learning patience, studying my routines, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever purpose brought them to this isolated corner of Montana. The rational explanations grow thinner each day, worn away by the steady accumulation of impossible evidence. Soon, I'll have to choose between sanity and truth, between the comfortable lie of delusion and the terrifying reality of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. Tonight, the watchers are closer than ever. I can feel their attention like heat from a dying fire, warming the back of my neck as I write these words. The stones have started appearing inside the house. 3 perfect spheres of granite arranged on my kitchen table each morning, despite locked doors and drawn curtains. They're coming for me soon. I know this with the same certainty that tells me winter follows autumn, and that wounded animals make dangerous prey. The only question is whether they'll take me to join whatever happened to that limping deer, or if they'll simply add my name to the list of Montana residents who vanished without explanation. Either way, I doubt anyone will believe the truth. The stones just started rolling again. 3 of them, moving across my bedroom floor with deliberate precision. They've stopped beside my feet, forming a perfect triangle. I think it's time. Story 2. The recorder never lies. That's what I kept telling myself as I played back the audio for the 47th time, headphones pressed against my ears until they ached. But the double tap was still there. 2 deliberate strikes against something hollow, always half a second before my own footsteps, like an echo arriving before the sound that caused it. It had been 3 weeks since Marcus and I returned from northern Michigan, and I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those leaves settled in a perfect line across the gravel road, pressed down as if something massive had passed over them, without quite touching the ground. The trip was supposed to be simple. Marcus, my colleague from the photography department at the university, had been pushing for months about this remote tract of woodland he'd discovered on a topographical survey. He claimed the light filtering through the canopy created perfect conditions for the kind of atmospheric shots that had made Ansel Adams famous. I needed the portfolio work, and frankly, I needed to get out of the city. The semester had been brutal, and my marriage was showing stress fractures that widened with each passing day. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in late October, when the maples were bleeding crimson, and the oaks held onto their brown leaves like desperate fists. The forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the high 50s, perfect hiking weather. Marcus navigated the increasingly narrow roads with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey before, though when I asked him about previous visits, he grew vague and changed the subject to camera settings. The trailhead was nothing more than a gap between trees marked by a weathered wooden post. No signs, no Park Service markers, just a barely visible path disappearing into the shadows between towering white pines and ancient hardwoods. I shouldered my camera bag and followed Marcus into the green twilight of the forest floor. For the first hour, everything felt normal. More than normal. Magical. The light was exactly as Marcus had described, falling in cathedral shafts through the canopy, illuminating patches of fern and moss that seemed to glow from within. I burned through 2 rolls of film capturing the interplay of shadow and illumination, the way individual leaves caught and held the dying afternoon sun like stained glass windows. Marcus moved ahead of me, supposedly scouting locations, but I noticed he kept glancing back toward the trail we'd left behind. When I asked if he was worried about finding our way out, he just shook his head and muttered something about wanting to make sure we had enough light for the return hike. The forest was unusually quiet. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the normal symphony of rustling leaves, bird calls, and small animals moving through underbrush. But here, the silence felt deliberate, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. It was around 4:30 when the woods changed. I can't explain exactly how. The light was the same, the temperature hadn't dropped, but something shifted in the atmosphere around us. The hair on my arms stood up, and I found myself automatically checking over my shoulder every few steps. Marcus had stopped about 20 yards ahead, standing perfectly still with his camera raised but not taking any pictures. When I caught up to him, his face was pale, and a thin line of sweat had appeared along his hairline despite the cool air. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened, straining to catch whatever had spooked him. Nothing, just that oppressive silence, somehow deeper now, as if the forest had drawn in on itself. "Hear what?" He lowered his camera and wiped his palms on his jeans. Never mind. Probably just a deer. But I hadn't heard anything that sounded like a deer. In fact, I hadn't heard anything at all, and that was what bothered me. Forests are never truly silent. There's always something. Wind in the branches, insects, the distant call of a bird. This was different. This was the silence that comes right before something terrible happens. We continued deeper into the woods, and I started the small digital recorder I always carried for taking notes about lighting conditions and camera settings. It was an old habit from journalism school that had stuck with me through my transition to fine art photography. Sometimes the most important details were too subtle to trust to memory. The trail began to climb, winding between massive tree trunks that seemed to close in around us. My boots found purchase on the carpet of leaves, and I listened to the rhythm of our footsteps. Marcus's heavy hiking boots striking slightly ahead of my lighter trail shoes. Left, right, a steady cadence that became almost meditative. That's when I first noticed the additional sound. It was subtle at first, just a slight irregularity in the pattern of our walking. But as I paid closer attention, I could distinguish a third set of footfalls, slightly offset from our own. Not behind us or ahead, but somewhere to our left, paralleling our route through the trees. I stopped walking. Marcus continued for several steps before realizing I was no longer following. "What's wrong?" he called back, his voice strangely thin in the dense air. "Listen." We both stood motionless, and immediately the third set of footsteps stopped as well. The silence rushed back in, complete and unsettling. "I don't hear anything," Marcus said, but his eyes were scanning the trees around us with obvious unease. "That's the problem." We resumed walking, and within a few steps, the extra footfalls returned. This time, Marcus heard them too. He turned toward the sound, raising his camera as if the telephoto lens might reveal what our eyes couldn't penetrate in the shadows between the trees. "Probably just an echo," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sound travels weird in these woods. Echoes don't arrive before the sounds that cause them, but I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I adjusted my grip on my camera strap and tried to ignore the growing certainty that we were being followed. The trail continued to climb, and the trees began to thin slightly. Through gaps in the canopy, I could see that the sun was getting lower, painting the few visible clouds in shades of orange and pink. We'd been hiking for nearly 2 hours, and according to the rough map Marcus had sketched, we should be approaching the scenic overlook he'd promised, a rocky outcropping that would provide the perfect vantage point for sunset shots. That's when something crossed the path ahead of us. I saw it first, a dark shape moving between the tree trunks about 50 yards up the trail. Tall, definitely bipedal, moving with a fluid gait that covered ground faster than any human runner I'd ever seen. It passed from left to right, visible for maybe 3 seconds before disappearing into the dense underbrush on the far side of the path. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, and I realized he'd seen it too. The thing had been moving through the fallen leaves, and we could hear the steady crunch of its passage even after it vanished from sight. The sound continued for several seconds, growing fainter as whatever it was moved deeper into the forest. Then, like a switch being thrown, the sound stopped completely. We stood frozen on the trail, waiting for something. Another glimpse, another sound, some indication of what we'd just witnessed. My hands shook as I raised my camera, knowing it was too late but needing to do something. The telephoto lens showed me nothing but trees and shadows. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. It had been too tall to be a person, moving too smoothly to be a bear. The way it had glided between the trees suggested something that belonged in this environment, something perfectly adapted to moving through dense forest without making unnecessary noise, something that knew we were there. We continued up the trail, but the easy companionship of the early afternoon had evaporated. Marcus kept his camera ready, scanning the trees around us with obvious nervousness. I found myself listening for the phantom footsteps, but they didn't return. Whatever had been paralleling our route had apparently found a more direct path to wherever it was going. The rocky overlook, when we finally reached it, was everything Marcus had promised. A natural stone platform jutted out from the hillside, providing an unobstructed view across miles of unbroken forest. The dying sun painted the entire landscape in warm hues that shifted from gold to deep amber as we watched. I shot 3 rolls of film in 20 minutes, capturing the changing light as it played across the canopy below. Marcus worked beside me, his digital camera clicking rapidly as he bracketed exposures and experimented with different focal lengths. For a brief time, The beauty of the scene overwhelmed our earlier unease. But as the sun dropped toward the horizon, the temperature began to fall noticeably. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around us and creating the normal forest sounds that had been absent during our hike. I checked my watch and realized we'd been on the overlook for nearly an hour. If we wanted to make it back to the car before full darkness, we needed to start moving. We should head back, I told Marcus as I packed away my gear. He nodded, shouldering his camera bag, but I noticed he kept glancing back toward the forest as we left the overlook. The return trail would take us through the same stretch of woods where we'd seen whatever it was that had crossed our path. The descent began normally enough. The trail was easier to follow going downhill, and the familiar rhythm of hiking helped restore some sense of normalcy. But as the light faded and the shadows grew longer, that oppressive silence returned. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the still air, and I found myself trying to walk more quietly, though I couldn't say why. 20 minutes into our descent, we heard the tires. The sound came from somewhere ahead of us and to the right. The high-pitched squeal of rubber against asphalt, followed immediately by the prolonged blast of a car horn. It was close, much closer than it should have been. According to Marcus's rough map, the nearest road was at least half a mile from our current position. We picked up our pace, following the trail as it curved toward the sound. Within minutes, we could see light filtering through the trees ahead, not the warm glow of sunset, but the harsh white illumination of headlights. The trail ended at a gravel road I hadn't known existed. A sedan sat in the middle of the narrow lane, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, engine running, driver's door standing open. The smell of burnt rubber hung in the air, and I could see fresh skid marks on the gravel where the car had braked hard. But there was no driver. Marcus and I approached the vehicle cautiously. The radio was playing softly, some classic rock station from a distant city. The keys dangled from the ignition, and a half-empty coffee cup sat in the center console, still warm. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the trees. "Is anyone there? Are you okay?" No response. The forest around us maintained its unnatural silence, as if even the normal evening sounds of insects and nightbirds were waiting for something to happen. I walked around to the front of the car, and that's when I saw them, the leaves. They were arranged in a perfect line across the gravel road, each one pressed flat against the surface as if something heavy had passed over them. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to indicate what might have created the pattern. The leaves looked as if they'd been settled by something that had weight but no substance, something that could press them down without quite touching the ground. The line of flattened leaves extended from the edge of the forest on one side of the road to the tree line on the other side, perhaps 30 feet in total. Whatever had created the pattern had moved in a perfectly straight line, undeviating and purposeful. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said. And for the first time since I'd known him, his voice carried a note of genuine fear. I agreed, but as we turned to head back into the forest, I noticed something else. The trees on both sides of the road were completely still, despite the wind we'd felt on the overlook. Not a single leaf moved. It was as if the entire stretch of forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. We practically ran back down the trail, our earlier caution forgotten in favor of speed. The path that had seemed so peaceful during our ascent now felt like a gauntlet, shadows reaching out from between the trees like grasping fingers. Every snap of a twig under our feet sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. And that's when the forest began to play its trick. Every time we stopped to catch our breath or check our bearings, the woods around us fell completely silent. Not just quiet, absolutely silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire ecosystem. No wind, no insects, no distant bird calls. Nothing. But the moment we started walking again, we could hear it. A subtle rustling in the underbrush, the sound of something large moving parallel to our route. Not following exactly, but keeping pace, staying just out of sight among the trees. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight, but the screen showed no signal bars. Not unusual in remote areas, but somehow more unsettling given everything else that had happened. The pale LED light pushed back the darkness only a few feet in any direction, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with us down the trail. Marcus had his own light, a more powerful headlamp that cut through the shadows more effectively. But even with both our lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something that had no trouble seeing in the complete darkness between the trees. The phantom footsteps returned about halfway back to the trailhead. This time there was no mistaking them for echoes or natural forest sounds. The rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. Something was walking with us, matching our pace, staying just beyond the reach of our lights. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Marcus. He nodded, his face pale in the reflected glow of his headlamp. "What do you think it is?" I didn't have an answer. The footsteps were too heavy to be a person, but too regular to be an animal. They had the measured cadence of something intelligent, something that understood the concept of stealth, and was choosing to let us know it was there. We reached the trailhead, just as full darkness settled over the forest. Our car sat exactly where we'd left it, looking almost absurdly normal in the circle of light from Marcus's headlamp. I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get inside and drive away from this place that had somehow become alien and threatening. The engine started on the first try, and I backed out of the small parking area faster than was probably safe on the narrow gravel road. As our headlights swept across the tree line, I thought I saw something large step back into the shadows. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, both of us processing what we'd experienced. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that Marcus finally spoke. "What do you think that thing was that crossed the path?" I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His face was thoughtful, no longer frightened but clearly puzzled by the day's events. "I don't know," I admitted. "Could have been a bear, I guess. They can move pretty fast when they want to." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't what we'd seen. Bears don't move with that fluid, purposeful gait. They don't create patterns of pressed leaves without leaving footprints. And they certainly don't match the rhythm of human footsteps while remaining completely invisible in dense forest. We drove back to the city, stopping only for gas and coffee. Marcus fell asleep somewhere around Bay City, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the occasional play of headlights from oncoming traffic. I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, though I couldn't say what I expected to see following us down the interstate. It wasn't until I got home and began processing the day's film that I remembered the digital recorder. I'd been running it almost constantly during our hike, making notes about lighting conditions and potential composition ideas. If there was any explanation for what we'd experienced, it might be captured in those hours of audio. I transferred the files to my computer and began listening, starting with our arrival at the trailhead. For the first hour, everything sounded normal. Our conversation, the crunch of leaves under our feet, my occasional technical notes about camera settings. But as I listened to the section recorded during our ascent, something odd began to emerge from the background noise. There it was, the double tap I'd been hearing for 3 weeks now. 2 deliberate strikes against something hollow, always half a second before my own footsteps. Not an echo, not a technical artifact, but a distinct sound that appeared on the recording exactly as I remembered hearing it in the forest. I isolated the section and played it over and over, trying to identify the source. The strikes had a wooden quality, like someone tapping on a hollow tree trunk, but the timing was impossible. They consistently preceded my footsteps by exactly half a second, as if something was marking my rhythm before I created it. I enhanced the audio, filtering out background noise and amplifying the frequencies where the tapping occurred. That's when I heard something else, a low rhythmic breathing that seemed to surround the microphone from all directions. Not human breathing, but something deeper, more deliberate, like the respiration of something much larger than a person. The breathing was synchronized with the tapping. Each double strike was followed by a long, slow exhale, as if whatever was creating the sound was timing its movements to my walking pace while maintaining its own natural respiratory rhythm. I called Marcus the next morning, but his reaction was frustratingly dismissive. He claimed to remember very little about the phantom footsteps and suggested that the acoustic properties of the forest had simply created some unusual echo effects. When I mentioned the audio recording, he seemed genuinely surprised that I'd been running the recorder at all. "I don't remember you making any notes," he said. Are you sure you had it turned on? But I had the files on my computer, hours of audio that clearly documented our entire hike. I played a section over the phone, the part where we'd both heard the footsteps paralleling our route. Marcus listened for several minutes, then claimed he couldn't hear anything unusual. "Sounds like normal forest ambiance to me," he said. "Maybe some wind in the trees." Wind doesn't create double taps with half-second precision. Wind doesn't breathe with the measured rhythm of something watching and waiting. But Marcus seemed genuinely unable to hear what was obvious to me, and his dismissal only increased my growing sense of isolation. I took the audio files to a sound engineer at the university, hoping professional equipment might reveal something I was missing. Sarah Chen had helped me with previous projects, and I trusted her technical expertise. But when I played the enhanced segments for her, her reaction was similar to Marcus's. "I'm not hearing anything that sounds artificial or unusual," she said, adjusting the studio monitors to their optimal settings. "There's some low-frequency rumble that might be wind or distant traffic, but nothing that suggests another presence." She was looking at me with the careful expression people use when they're worried about someone's mental state. I realized that insisting on the reality of sounds that apparently only I could hear was beginning to make me look unstable. But the sounds were there. I could isolate them, enhance them, play them back at different speeds and frequencies. The double tapping was as clear as my own voice on the recording, and the synchronized breathing was even more obvious when I filtered out the higher frequencies. I began to wonder if the problem wasn't with the audio, but with me. Was I experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination that was somehow being reinforced by my expectations when I listened to the recordings? Had the stress of the failing marriage and academic pressures finally caught up with me in the form of paranoid delusions? But the physical evidence was harder to dismiss. I'd seen the line of pressed leaves across the gravel road, and Marcus had seen them too. I'd photographed them with my film camera, and when I developed the roll, they were exactly as I remembered. A perfect line of flattened vegetation with no corresponding footprints or tire tracks. I showed the photograph to Marcus, hoping it would jog his memory of the abandoned car and the strange scene we'd encountered. But his reaction was puzzling. "Nice composition," he said, studying the print. "Where did you take this?" "I don't remember this road." He was looking at the image as if he'd never seen it before. As if the entire sequence of events, the squealing tires, the running car with its door standing open, the impossible line of pressed leaves, had never happened. I pressed him for details, describing the scene in careful detail. But Marcus maintained that we'd hiked straight from the trailhead to the overlook and back again without encountering any roads or vehicles. According to his memory, the return hike had been completely uneventful. "Maybe you're thinking of a different trip," he suggested. "Or maybe you saw something like that in a movie or a magazine and it got mixed up with our actual experience." But I had the photograph. I had the audio recording. I had the crystal clear memory of standing next to that abandoned car, smelling the burnt rubber, seeing the keys dangling from the ignition. Those things had happened, regardless of what Marcus remembered or failed to remember. That night, I listened to the audio files again, and the double tapping seemed louder, more insistent. I began to hear additional sounds I'd missed before, subtle creaking noises that suggested the presence of something large moving through the trees, always just beyond the range of my microphone. And underneath it all, that rhythmic breathing, deep and patient, like something that had all the time in the world to watch and wait. I haven't been sleeping well. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in those woods, feeling the weight of unseen observation. I've started leaving lights on throughout the house, telling myself it's for practical reasons, but knowing it's really because darkness now feels like a living thing that might contain anything. The tapping has started appearing in other recordings, not just the files from Michigan, but newer audio, lectures I've recorded for my classes, phone conversations with colleagues, even the ambient sound recording I made last week in my own backyard. Always the same double tap, always half a second ahead of some other rhythmic sound. I played one of these newer files for Sarah Chen, hoping she might finally hear what I was experiencing. But her reaction was the same, polite confusion followed by carefully professional concern. "David," she said, using my name in the gentle tone reserved for people who might be having a breakdown. There's nothing unusual in any of these recordings. Maybe you should consider talking to someone about the stress you've been under lately. But I know what I'm hearing. I know what I experienced in those Michigan woods. Something was there with us. Something that could move through the forest without leaving tracks. Something that could breathe and tap and watch while remaining completely invisible to cameras and apparently inaudible to everyone except me. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't whether it was real. The question is whether it followed me home. Last night, I heard the double tapping outside my bedroom window. Not on the audio files this time, but directly, transmitted through the glass and walls of my house. When I looked outside, the street was empty, lit by the familiar glow of streetlights and porch lamps. But in the space between two pools of light, something large shifted in the shadows, keeping pace with my movement along the window. I'm writing this at 3 a.m, with every light in the house blazing and the digital recorder running on the desk beside me. If something is out there, if something followed me back from those silent woods, then maybe this time I'll capture evidence that others can't dismiss or explain away. But part of me wonders if that's what I really want. Part of me suspects that the only thing worse than being haunted by something invisible would be proving that it actually exists. The recorder is picking up my typing, my breathing, the hum of the fluorescent light above my desk. And underneath it all, if I listen carefully, I can hear something else. 2 soft taps against wood, arriving half a second before each keystroke, as if something is marking my rhythm before I create it. As if something has been marking my rhythm all along, and I'm only now learning how to listen. Story 3. The concrete felt wrong beneath my sneakers. Too smooth, like it had been polished recently, which made no sense for a service area under the Pulaski Skyway. Marcus was already crouched near the support pillar, adjusting his camera settings, the afternoon light filtering through the bridge's steel lattice above us, casting shifting shadows that moved with a rhythm I couldn't quite place. I'd been documenting street art across Jersey for months, building a portfolio that captured the raw energy of urban expression. This spot had been on my list since discovering it online, supposedly home to some of the most intricate pieces in the tri-state area. But standing here now, camera in hand, something felt off about the whole place. The graffiti was there all right. Elaborate murals stretched across the concrete walls, their colors vibrant despite the dim lighting. Yet the longer I stared, the more the artwork seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. Peripheral vision playing tricks, I told myself. Focusing the lens on a particularly striking piece, a swirl of blues and blacks that seemed to spiral deeper into the wall than should have been possible. Marcus called out that he'd found something incredible near the far end, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The acoustics down here were weird, making sounds bounce in ways that didn't match the geometry of the area. I made my way toward him, noting how our footsteps seemed to multiply, as if more than 2 people were walking on the concrete. That's when I noticed the maintenance plaques mounted on the walls. Standard city infrastructure stuff, but the numbers looked fresh, like they'd been installed recently. Too recently, and the fonts were slightly wrong. Close to standard municipal typography, but not quite right. Like someone had tried to replicate official signage from memory. I was examining one of these plaques when he appeared. No sound of approaching footsteps. No warning. One moment Marcus and I were alone. The next a man in a bright yellow reflective vest stood 15 feet away, hands clasped behind his back, watching us with an expression that seemed pleasant enough, but somehow never reached his eyes. He asked who had authorized our presence here, his tone conversational, but carrying an undertone that made my stomach tighten. The man explained we needed to follow him to the maintenance office to verify our credentials, gesturing toward a section of the service area I hadn't noticed before. A concrete structure that definitely hadn't been there when we'd first arrived. I told him I'd call the number on the maintenance plaque to confirm the procedure, pulling out my phone. He smiled then, an expression that lasted just a fraction too long, and rattled off the 10-digit number before I could even focus on the small print. But something was wrong with what he'd said. The cadence was right, the confidence absolute. But two of the middle digits had been different from what I could make out on the weathered sign. The realization hit me like cold water. He'd known I was going to call. He'd prepared an answer that was almost right, but not quite. The kind of mistake someone would make if they were trying to recreate something from memory under pressure. Marcus was standing closer to the supposed maintenance office now, camera lowered, his usual enthusiasm replaced by something that looked like confusion. He kept glancing between the man in the vest and the building, as if trying to reconcile something that didn't make sense. I walked toward the maintenance plaque, pretending to double-check the number while watching the man from my peripheral vision. He remained perfectly still, that strange smile fixed in place, not seeming to breathe. The vest he wore was too clean, too bright, like it had never seen actual work. And now that I was paying attention, I couldn't hear any of the background noise you'd expect from city infrastructure. No distant traffic, no mechanical hums. Nothing but our own breathing and the subtle echo of sounds that shouldn't have been echoing. The emergency phone mounted next to the plaque was an old model, the kind the city had been phasing out for years. When I lifted the heavy black handset, I expected the familiar dial tone. Instead, there was nothing, not even static. I followed the thick cable with my eyes and found it disappearing into a conduit, but the metal housing had been severed cleanly about 3 feet from the phone. The cut looked recent, the metal bright and sharp. Someone had wanted it to look functional from a distance, but ensured it would never actually work. My hand started to shake as I replaced the handset. The man in the vest was still smiling, still standing in exactly the same position, but now I noticed that his shadow fell in the wrong direction. The light filtering down from above should have cast his shadow toward the back wall, but instead it stretched toward us, long and dark, and somehow more solid than shadows should be. Marcus called my name, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. He was pointing at the wall near the maintenance building, where a series of arrows had been mounted to indicate emergency exits. Standard safety protocol for city facilities. But these arrows were pointing deeper into the service area, away from where we'd entered, towards sections that disappeared into darkness. I moved closer to examine them, and found they'd been placed over older arrows, the originals barely visible around the edges of the newer signs. The original arrows pointed toward the entrance we'd used. These new ones, bright and freshly mounted, directed anyone following them further into the maze of concrete and steel beneath the bridge. Someone had deliberately reversed them. The man in the vest suggested we should move along to the office, his tone still pleasant, still conversational, but now carrying an edge of impatience. He gestured again toward the concrete building, and I noticed that his movements were too fluid, like he was performing actions he'd rehearsed many times. From inside the structure came a low, steady sound, the hum of ventilation equipment running at full capacity. But looking up at the building's exterior, I couldn't see any ductwork, no vents, no external equipment that would require such powerful air circulation. The sound was wrong too. Not the steady mechanical whir of HVAC equipment, but something organic and rhythmic, like breathing. Marcus stepped closer to me, and I could feel the tension radiating from him. He whispered that something was wrong with the building's proportions, that from the outside, it looked like it could hold maybe 2 small rooms, but the sounds coming from inside suggested a much larger space. The ventilation noise seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, as if the building extended much further than its exterior dimensions should have allowed. I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of following the man toward the building, I grabbed Marcus by the arm and started walking quickly toward what I hoped was still the way we'd entered. The man in the vest called after us, his voice losing its conversational tone, becoming sharp and urgent. He insisted we needed to complete the credential verification process, that leaving without proper authorization would result in complications. But I was already moving, pulling Marcus along, trying to retrace our path through the service area. The problem was, nothing looked the same as when we'd arrived. The graffiti on the walls had changed. Not dramatically, but in subtle ways that made me question whether I'd really seen what I thought I'd seen earlier. Colors seemed different, arrangements shifted, and some pieces appeared to have been painted over entirely. The concrete walls seemed to curve differently now, creating turns and angles that definitely hadn't been there before. What should have been a straight path back to the entrance had become a maze of corridors and passages, each looking similar enough to the others that I couldn't be sure which way led out. Behind us, the man in the vest was following, but his footsteps had changed. Instead of the sharp click of work boots on concrete, there was a softer sound, like bare feet on stone. And there were too many footsteps, as if he'd been joined by others I couldn't see. The ventilation sound from the building was getting louder, following us through the concrete passages, seeming to come from the walls themselves now. Marcus kept looking back over his shoulder, and each time he did, his face grew paler. When I asked what he was seeing, he just shook his head and urged me to move faster. We found ourselves in a section of the service area that definitely hadn't existed when we'd first arrived. The ceiling was lower here, the walls closer together, and the lighting came from sources I couldn't identify. Not the natural light filtering down from above, but something artificial and harsh that cast everything in stark, unforgiving detail. More maintenance plaques lined the walls here, dozens of them, all bearing numbers in sequences that made no mathematical sense. Phone numbers with too many digits, dates that referenced months that didn't exist, authorization codes that used letters and symbols I'd never seen before. And still that breathing sound followed us, growing stronger, more insistent. I realized we were moving in circles when we passed the same section of graffiti for the third time. A mural depicting eyes that seemed to track our movement, pupils dilating and contracting as we walked by. Marcus had stopped taking pictures entirely, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck as he focused on finding a way out of what had become a concrete labyrinth. The man in the vest appeared ahead of us then, somehow having circled around without our noticing. He stood in the center of the passage, no longer smiling, his reflective vest now seeming to glow with its own internal light. He explained that the credential verification process was mandatory, that there were regulations and procedures that couldn't be bypassed. But his voice was different now, carrying harmonics that voices shouldn't have, echoing from directions that didn't correspond to where he was standing. And when I looked closely at his face, I noticed that his features weren't quite consistent. Eyes that changed color between blinks, a jawline that shifted slightly when he turned his head, skin that seemed to move independently of the underlying structure. I grabbed Marcus and turned down a side passage, running now, not caring where it led as long as it was away from the thing wearing the maintenance vest. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, the walls pressing closer with each step, the ceiling dropping until we had to duck to avoid hitting our heads. And then, suddenly, we were outside. Not gradually, not through any entrance or exit we could identify, but simply outside, standing in late afternoon sunlight on a sidewalk next to the Pulaski Skyway. Cars passed normally, people walked by without giving us a second glance, and the world looked exactly as it should have. We looked back at the bridge, trying to identify where we'd just been, but the service area we'd spent the last hour navigating was nowhere to be seen. The support structures looked different, the graffiti was gone, and there was no sign of any maintenance building or emergency phones or reversed exit arrows. Marcus checked his camera. Every photo he'd taken inside the service area was gone, replaced by images of empty concrete walls and normal city infrastructure. My phone showed no record of the attempted call to the maintenance number, and when I tried to recall the exact digits, I found I couldn't remember them clearly. We drove home in silence, both of us trying to process what had happened, neither willing to voice the questions we were both thinking. Had we imagined it? Shared hallucination? Some kind of gas leak that had affected our perception? But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the vest, about his too perfect knowledge of a phone number that didn't quite match the one on the sign, about ventilation sounds coming from a building with no visible ductwork, about arrows that had been carefully reversed to lead people deeper into a maze that shouldn't have existed. And I kept thinking about that breathing sound, so organic and rhythmic, like something large and alive hidden behind concrete walls, waiting patiently for the next visitors to follow the helpful maintenance worker to the credential verification office. I never went back to photograph graffiti under bridges. Some places, I realized, were designed to be photographed only once, and some maintenance workers were very, very good at their jobs, whatever those jobs actually were. The question that haunts me isn't whether what we experienced was real. The question is whether we were the first photographers to be invited to verify our credentials, or just the first ones lucky enough to decline the invitation. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that ventilation sound in the walls of my apartment. And sometimes, when I check the maintenance plaques in my own building, I notice that the numbers have changed since the last time I looked. Story 4. The moss clung to everything like wet velvet, transforming the Oregon Trail into something that belonged more in a fairy tale than on my GPS route. I'd been pedaling alone for 3 hours when I reached the stretch where the hemlocks grew so thick they swallowed the afternoon light, leaving only a green-tinged twilight that made my bike computer's screen seem unnaturally bright against the handlebars. I needed the coffee break. My thermos had been calling to me for the last 5 miles, and this seemed like the perfect spot. Secluded, peaceful, with that particular Oregon silence that feels almost sacred. The kind of quiet that makes city dwellers uncomfortable, but draws people like me deeper into the wilderness every weekend. The moss beneath my feet compressed with a soft squelch as I dismounted, releasing the earthy scent of decay and new growth that defines these ancient forests. I unscrewed my thermos cap and poured the dark liquid into my collapsible cup, watching steam rise in delicate spirals that disappeared into the heavy air. The first sip was perfect, bitter, hot, exactly what I needed before tackling the next 10 miles. That's when I heard it. The sound was unmistakably a meow, but wrong in every way that mattered. It carried a metallic quality, like someone had run a cat's cry through a digital processor and stripped away everything warm and alive. More disturbing still, it came in stutters, distinct pauses that reminded me of buffering audio files, as if reality itself was struggling to load properly. I lowered my cup and whispered into the green dimness, "Is someone there?" The response came immediately, a perfect mimicry of my own voice thrown back at me. "Is someone there?" But it carried that same metallic distortion, that digital stutter, as if something had recorded my words and was playing them back through damaged speakers hidden among the ferns. The air changed. I felt it first in my lungs. What had been the typical Oregon humidity suddenly became thick, almost gelatinous. Each breath required effort, like trying to inhale through wet cotton. The sensation made my chest tight, triggered some primal warning system that told me to run before my rational mind had even processed what was happening. I capped my thermos with hands that had started to shake, though I told myself it was just the caffeine hitting my empty stomach. The explanation felt thin even as I thought it, but I clung to it anyway, better than considering the alternatives. The second meow came from directly behind me. I spun around but saw only the cathedral of hemlock trunks stretching back the way I'd come. No cats, no people, nothing that could explain the sound that had been so close I should have felt breath on my neck. Before I could fully process this, a third meow echoed from my right side. The same metallic quality, the same digital stuttering, but this time I was listening more carefully. There was something deliberate about the timing, something calculated that made my skin crawl. A fourth meow from my left completed what I was beginning to recognize as a pattern. 3 points of sound, each equidistant from where I stood, forming what felt like the corners of a triangle with me at the center. The mathematical precision of it was somehow more terrifying than if the sounds had been random. I grabbed my bike and started pushing it back toward the main trail, no longer caring that I looked like someone fleeing from invisible threats. The moss seemed to grab at my wheels, and twice I nearly stumbled as the ground gave way more than expected under my feet. The meowing followed me, not the sounds themselves, but the sensation of them, that feeling of being triangulated, measured, marked. I could sense the invisible points moving with me, maintaining their precise distance and formation as I hurried through the undergrowth. My bike computer, which had been dutifully tracking my route all morning, began to flicker. The bright screen that had seemed so reassuring now strobed between normal display and complete darkness. During the dark phases, I caught glimpses of something else. Fragmentary images that lasted only milliseconds, but seemed to show a map I didn't recognize, with terrain features that defied geography. I reached my bike back onto the trail proper and swung a leg over, not bothering to check my gear or adjust my helmet. I just started pedaling, pushing harder than I had all day, driven by an urgency I couldn't fully explain but didn't dare ignore. The forest blurred past me as I picked up speed, but the sensation of being tracked didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. I could feel those 3 points of attention like physical weights, pressing against my awareness from behind, right, and left. The mathematical precision never wavered. 5 miles later, when I finally stopped to check my bike computer, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I understood about the morning's ride. According to the GPS data, I had lost signal for exactly 47 minutes. The gap in my route formed a perfect circle, with the moss-covered clearing where I'd heard the first meow at its precise center. But that was impossible. I'd been there for maybe 10 minutes, 15 at most. I remembered every moment. Pouring the coffee, taking those first few sips, hearing the sounds, fleeing. It couldn't have been more than a quarter hour. I scrolled through the data repeatedly, but the numbers didn't change. 47 minutes of missing time, captured in a circle so geometrically perfect, it looked like it had been drawn with a compass. The ride home passed in a blur of second-guessing and rationalization. Dead zones and GPS coverage were common in dense forests. Equipment malfunctions happened. Maybe I'd dozed off without realizing it, though the idea of falling asleep while standing up with a cup of hot coffee in my hands struck me as absurd. But it wasn't until I uploaded my ride data to Strava that night that I found the detail that made sleep impossible. Other riders had been on that trail. Their GPS tracks were clearly visible, overlaying mine from earlier in the day and later in the afternoon. But every single one of them showed the same phenomenon. A perfect circular gap in their data, centered on the exact same clearing. The timestamps varied. Some had been there at dawn, others near sunset. But regardless of when they'd passed through, each had lost signal for precisely 47 minutes, their tracks forming identical circles that overlapped with supernatural precision. I spent hours scrolling through the data, looking at rides from the past week, the past month. The pattern held consistent. Every rider who had traveled that section of trail had experienced the same gap, the same perfect circle, the same missing time. But none of them had posted comments about it. No one mentioned equipment failures or strange experiences. Their ride descriptions were normal. Complaints about mud, celebration of personal records, photos of scenic overlooks, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I found myself returning to that data obsessively over the following days. I created accounts on different platforms, searched cycling forums, even reached out to other riders directly. No one remembered anything strange about that section of trail. When I described the metallic meowing, the heavy air, the sensation of being tracked, they looked at me with the polite concern usually reserved for people who claim to have seen UFOs. But the GPS data didn't lie. The circles were there, visible to anyone who cared to look. Perfect, consistent, impossible to explain through normal means. 2 weeks later, I found myself back on the same trail. I told myself it was just a coincidence. This was one of my regular routes after all. But I'd packed extra batteries for my GPS unit, brought a backup phone, even carried a small digital recorder. If something happened again, I wanted evidence. The clearing looked exactly as I remembered it. The same moss-covered ground, the same cathedral of hemlocks, the same green-tinged twilight. I dismounted and went through the same routine. Thermos out, coffee poured, first careful sip. This time, I was listening from the beginning. The forest was completely silent. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no whisper of wind through the canopy. Even my own breathing seemed muted, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. Then I heard it, but not the metallic meowing I'd expected. Instead, it was my own voice, playing back words I'd spoken 2 weeks earlier. Is someone there? The recording was perfect, capturing not just the words but the slight tremor of uncertainty, the way my voice had caught on the last syllable. But it carried that same digital stutter, those same artificial pauses that made it sound like a damaged file. More voices followed, other writers, other times, fragments of conversation, exclamations of surprise, confused questions about GPS failures. all processed through that same metallic filter, all broken into those same stuttering segments. I realized I was listening to a collection. Every word spoken in this clearing, by every rider who had ever stopped here, preserved and played back like a broken audio archive. The sounds weren't random. They were a catalog, a record of human presence in this space. My GPS unit was already flickering, the screen cycling between normal display and those strange, impossible maps. But this time I was watching carefully, trying to make sense of the images that flashed by too quickly to fully comprehend. They weren't maps of this place. They showed the same circular clearing, the same configuration of trees, but from perspectives that couldn't exist. Aerial views from directly above, cross-sections showing the forest floor extending down into geological strata that didn't match Oregon's geology, and stranger views still that seemed to show the space from multiple angles simultaneously, as if it were being observed from several dimensions at once. The sensation of being tracked returned, those 3 points of attention fixing on me with the same mathematical precision. But now I understood what I was feeling. It wasn't malevolent exactly. It was more like being scanned, measured, cataloged. Something was documenting my presence here, adding my data to whatever collection it maintained. I looked down at my bike computer to find it displaying information I'd never seen before. Instead of speed and distance, the screen showed coordinates that didn't correspond to any mapping system I recognized. Measurements in units I couldn't identify, and most disturbing of all, a timer counting up from 0000. The numbers were climbing steadily, but when I checked my watch, no time was passing at all. The second hand had stopped moving, frozen between 2 tick marks as if time itself had become negotiable in this space. I stayed longer this time, not by choice. My legs simply wouldn't respond when I tried to mount my bike and leave. I was held there, not by force, but by a kind of temporal suspension that made movement feel like pushing through thick syrup. The voices continued to play around me, layering over each other in ways that should have been cacophonous but somehow created a strange harmony. I began to recognize patterns, repetitions, the same phrases cycling through at regular intervals as if the entire archive was being sampled and remixed. When I finally regained the ability to move, my bike computer showed that I'd been there for 47 minutes exactly. But according to my watch, no time had passed at all. The sun was in the same position. The shadows hadn't shifted. Even the steam from my abandoned coffee cup was still rising in the same delicate spirals. I rode home in a state of detached observation, no longer questioning my sanity, but no longer entirely certain of my humanity either. Whatever was happening in that clearing wasn't bound by the rules I'd always assumed governed reality. It was documenting something, collecting something, preserving some aspect of human presence that existed outside normal space and time. The GPS data confirmed what I already knew. Another perfect circle, another 47-minute gap, another impossible precision that defied explanation. But this time, I noticed something else. The circle was slightly larger than before. I've been back 17 times now. Each visit adds to the collection, contributes another data point to whatever archive exists in that space between the hemlocks. The circle grows incrementally with each trip, expanding by degrees so small they're almost undetectable. I no longer tell myself I'm going there by accident. I'm drawn back, compelled by the same force that stops time and records voices and maintains those impossibly perfect mathematical relationships. Part of me understands that I'm being changed by these visits, that each exposure to whatever exists in that clearing takes something from me and leaves something else in return. But I can't stop going back. The need to understand has become greater than my fear of what understanding might cost. The other riders continue to pass through, continue to lose exactly 47 minutes, continue to experience gaps in their GPS data that form perfect circles. None of them remember. None of them seem affected. Whatever is happening to me is happening by choice, or by some quality that makes me particularly suitable for whatever process is underway. Last week I brought a camera. The images it captured don't show the clearing as I experienced it. Instead, they show something that looks like a normal forest glen, peaceful and unremarkable. But when I examine them closely, I can see subtle distortions in the shadows, angles that don't quite work, reflections in surfaces that shouldn't be reflective. The camera recorded 47 minutes of footage, but when I play it back, it lasts only seconds. The compression isn't technical, it's temporal. Somehow the device captured time itself being folded, condensed, processed into a format that could exist outside that space. I've started to suspect that the clearing isn't just documenting visitors, it's translating them, converting human experience into something that can be preserved, studied, understood by intelligences that don't experience reality the way we do. We're being processed, sampled, archived in ways that leave us mostly intact, but fundamentally changed. The evidence is accumulating in ways that can't be ignored. My reflection doesn't quite match my movements anymore. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself acting out sequences I don't remember performing. My dreams have become too vivid, too precisely detailed, as if they're being experienced by someone else, and then shared with me secondhand. But perhaps the most disturbing change is how normal it all feels. The strangeness should be overwhelming, should drive me away from that trail forever. Instead, it's becoming comfortable, familiar, almost routine. Each visit feels more like coming home than venturing into the unknown. I understand now that I'm part of the collection. Whatever exists in that moss-covered clearing has been slowly documenting me, creating a record of my presence that exists outside normal time and space. The GPS circles aren't gaps in the data. They're perfect preservation chambers, moments of experience extracted and stored in ways that human technology can detect but not comprehend. Tomorrow I'm going back. Not because I need to understand anymore, but because I'm expected. The 47 minutes are calling, and the metallic voices are waiting to add my words to their archive. I won't remember, just like the other writers don't remember. But some part of me will remain there, in that space between seconds, contributing to whatever impossible catalog is being built in the green twilight under the hemlocks. The circle will grow a little larger, the collection will be a little more complete, and I'll ride home, checking my GPS data, wondering why 47 minutes of my life have been compressed into a perfect geometric impossibility. Until next time. Story 5. The horse beneath me shifted restlessly as I studied the trail map one final time, its edges already soft from the morning dew that clung to everything in these Vermont woods. I'd ridden these paths dozens of times over the years, knew every switchback and clearing by heart, yet something felt different today. The air hung heavier than usual, thick with a silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Just nervous about riding alone, I muttered to myself, folding the map and tucking it into my jacket pocket. The rental stable owner had been hesitant about letting me take Magnus, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, on the longer forest route without a guide. But I'd convinced him with stories of my familiarity with the area, my years of experience navigating these particular trails that wound through the Green Mountains. Magnus snorted and pawed the ground, his breath visible in small puffs despite the unseasonably warm October morning. I gave him a reassuring pat on the neck and urged him forward into the tree line, where the canopy immediately swallowed us in dappled shadows. The first hour passed normally enough. We followed the main trail as it meandered alongside Beaver Creek, the water gurgling cheerfully over moss-covered stones. Familiar landmarks appeared and disappeared behind us. The lightning-split oak, the boulder that resembled a sleeping bear, the wooden bridge with its single loose plank that always groaned under a horse's weight. But as we climbed higher into the mountains, something began to feel wrong. It started with the compass. Every time I checked it, the needle pointed steadily west, confirming we were heading in the right direction toward the old logging road that would loop us back toward the stable. Yet the terrain around us began to repeat itself in ways that made no sense. The same distinctive rock formation appeared 3 times, each instance accompanied by that peculiar sense of déjà vu that makes your skin crawl. Magnus grew increasingly agitated as we rode, his ears swiveling constantly as if tracking sounds I couldn't hear. When I tried to guide him down a familiar fork in the trail, one I'd taken countless times before, he balked, dancing sideways and tossing his head. I coaxed him forward, But within minutes we found ourselves facing a fallen fence that definitely hadn't been there on my last visit 2 months ago. The fence stretched between two massive pines, its weathered posts leaning at odd angles, barbed wire tangled in rusty spirals. It blocked the trail completely, forcing us to backtrack and try another route. But the second path led to the same fence, appearing so suddenly around a bend that Magnus snorted and shied away from it. My hands tightened on the reins as a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept up my spine. I pulled out the compass again, watching the needle swing confidently toward west. According to every indication, we were making progress, moving steadily toward our destination. Yet the landscape around us had begun to feel like a funhouse mirror, reflecting back the same elements in slightly different arrangements. The third time we encountered the fence, I dismounted and approached it on foot. The wood was gray with age, splintered in some places, but the metal hinges still gleamed with traces of oil. Fresh scratches marked the posts, as if something large had recently brushed against them. I ran my fingers along the gouges, trying to determine what could have made such marks, when Magnus whinnied behind me. I turned to find him staring past me into the woods, his whole body tense with alertness. Following his gaze, I saw nothing but the typical Vermont forest, maple and birch trees showing their fall colors, understory thick with ferns and fallen leaves. But something about the scene felt staged, too perfect, like a photograph that had been carefully composed. We tried 4 more paths after that, each leading back to variations of the same barrier. Sometimes it was the fallen fence. Sometimes a massive tree had apparently toppled across the trail, its trunk too high to climb over and too thick to go around. Once we found ourselves facing what appeared to be a small landslide that had swept down the hillside, depositing enough rocks and debris to make passage impossible. The worst part was the compass. No matter which direction we actually traveled, no matter how many times we doubled back or took seemingly random turns, the needle continued to point steadily west. I began to suspect the instrument was broken, but when I held it at different angles, moved it away from any metal on my saddle, even placed it on a flat rock several yards from Magnus, it behaved exactly as it should. The needle found magnetic north, then swung to show our heading, always indicating westward progress. After the 7th blocked path, I started noticing other things. The same fallen log kept appearing beside the trail, distinctive for the bright green lichen that had grown across its surface in a pattern that resembled a crude map. The first time I saw it, I barely registered it as anything unusual. The second time, it triggered a vague sense of recognition. By the 4th encounter, I found myself staring at it with growing unease, trying to convince myself that Vermont forests were full of similar logs, that lichen patterns weren't unique, that my mind was simply making connections where none existed. But it was the bottle that finally shattered my attempts at rational explanation. Half buried beside a cluster of birch trees, only its neck and shoulders visible above the leaf litter, sat an old glass bottle. Brown glass, the kind used for beer or patent medicines in an earlier era, with a chip in the rim and a label so faded that only ghost traces of text remained visible. I'd noticed it during our second pass through this section of woods, thinking it was just more evidence of careless hikers leaving their trash behind. When we encountered it for the 5th time, I couldn't ignore the implications any longer. Magnus seemed to sense my growing agitation. He moved beneath me with a restless energy, occasionally breaking into a sideways prance that I had to correct with firm pressure from my legs. His ears remained in constant motion, and several times I caught him staring off into sections of forest that looked no different from any other. When I followed his gaze, I saw nothing unusual, but the feeling of being observed settled over me like a weight. The trees themselves began to feel wrong. Oh, they were the right species for this part of Vermont. Sugar maples showing off their brilliant orange foliage, yellow birches with their distinctive peeling bark, the occasional white pine towering above the deciduous canopy. But their arrangement struck me as too deliberate, too carefully composed. It was as if someone had designed this forest rather than letting it grow naturally, placing each tree to create maximum visual impact while ensuring that sight lines remained limited, that no vista extended more than 30 or 40 yards in any direction. Sound behaved strangely too. Our hoofbeats, which should have echoed off the surrounding trees and rocks, seemed muffled, absorbed by the forest itself. When I called out experimentally, my voice fell flat, lacking the resonance it should have had in such terrain. Even Magnus's occasional snorts and the creak of leather seemed dampened, as if the very air was conspiring to muffle our presence. By mid-afternoon, my nerves were stretched taut as wire. We'd been riding for over 5 hours, following what should have been a 3-hour loop trail, and every attempt to find our way out had led us back to the same handful of landmarks: the fallen fence, the lichen-covered log, the half-buried bottle. They appeared and reappeared with the persistence of a recurring nightmare. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The thought crept in gradually, gaining strength each time we rounded a bend to find ourselves facing another impassable barrier. Maybe the stress of the past year had finally caught up with me. Maybe my recent divorce, the job loss, the constant financial pressure had pushed me over some invisible edge into madness. Maybe I was sitting in a psychiatric facility somewhere, imagining this entire experience while doctors discussed my treatment plan in hushed voices. But Magnus was real. I could feel his warmth beneath me, smell the earthy scent of his coat mixed with leather and sweat. When he shifted his weight or tossed his head, the movement was too complex, too authentic to be a hallucination. My hands on the reins, the autumn air on my face, the gradual ache developing in my lower back from hours in the saddle, all of it felt absolutely genuine. The sun was beginning to angle low through the trees when I finally made a decision that went against every instinct I possessed. We just encountered the fallen fence for what felt like the 20th time, and Magnus was dancing nervously beneath me, clearly picking up on my mounting panic. I stared at the barrier, noting details I'd missed before: the way shadows fell across the weathered wood, the precise angle of the leaning posts, the pattern of rust stains on the tangled wire. Everything was exactly as it had been during our previous encounters. Not similar, identical. I dismounted and approached Magnus's head, looking directly into his dark eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness, and something that might have been understanding. For a wild moment, I wondered if he knew something I didn't, if horses possessed some sense that humans had lost generations ago. "I don't know what's happening here," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But you do, don't you?" His ears flicked forward, focusing on my words. I took a deep breath, tasting the forest air with its complex mixture of decomposing leaves, pine sap, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of ozone before a thunderstorm, though the sky remained cloudless. "Home," I said, and dropped the reins. Magnus stood motionless for several heartbeats, his head raised as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Then, without any signal from me, he turned and began walking in a direction I would never have chosen. Not back along any of the trails we'd already tried, but straight into what appeared to be impenetrable forest. I grabbed for the reins, instinctively wanting to regain control, but something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe it was the growing certainty that traditional navigation had become meaningless in this place where compasses lied and familiar landmarks repeated themselves in impossible ways. Magnus moved with purpose now, his earlier nervousness replaced by calm determination. He picked his way between trees that seemed to shift subtly aside, allowing passage where none had existed moments before. Branches that should have blocked our path swayed away without any wind to move them. Fallen logs that had appeared insurmountable from a distance proved to have convenient gaps or natural bridges. The forest around us began to change, subtly at first, then more dramatically. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks scarred with the passage of centuries. The undergrowth thinned, replaced by carpets of moss that muffled even Magnus's hoofbeats to complete silence. Shafts of golden sunlight slanted through the canopy at angles that defied the time of day, creating pools of warmth that felt more like memory than reality. I had the strangest sensation that we were moving not just through space, but through time itself, descending through layers of history like an archaeologist digging through sedimentary rock. The air grew thicker, charged with potential, and I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. shadows that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely. Then, abruptly, we emerged into bright sunlight. The field that spread before us was nothing like the Vermont landscape I knew. The grass was wrong, too green, too uniform, extending in an unbroken carpet toward distant hills that shimmered with heat haze despite the cool October air. No fences marked property boundaries. No power lines traced across the sky. Even the quality of light seemed different, more golden, more intense, as if filtered through atmosphere that contained slightly different gases than the air I'd been breathing all my life. I turned in the saddle to look back at the forest we'd emerged from, and my blood went cold. The tree line wavered like a mirage, its edges fluid and uncertain. As I watched, individual trees seemed to phase in and out of existence, their outlines blurring and resharpening in a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. The entire forest appeared to be breathing, expanding and contracting with slow, deliberate patience. Magnus stood perfectly still beneath me, apparently unbothered by the impossible sight. His breathing was even, his posture relaxed, as if this was exactly where he'd expected to find us. When I looked down at him, I caught something in his expression that I'd never noticed before, an ancient wisdom that seemed far too profound for a rental horse from a small Vermont stable. The realization hit me with crystalline clarity. Magnus wasn't just a horse. He never had been. And if that was true, then what did it mean about everything else? The repeating landmarks, the impossible paths, the compass that insisted we were heading west while leading us in circles. What did it mean about the forest itself, which had seemed to rearrange itself around us like a living puzzle? Most importantly, what did it mean about me? Was I the same person who'd entered these woods this morning, or had something fundamental changed during our journey through that breathing forest? When I'd dropped the reins and spoken that single word, home, what destination had I actually chosen? I looked out across the impossible field, watching distant heat shimmer rise from grass that shouldn't exist in October Vermont, and realized I might never know the answers to those questions. The only certainty was that some journeys, once begun, can never be retraced. Behind us, the forest continued its slow, hypnotic breathing, waiting with infinite patience for the next traveler who would mistake its shifting paths for simple woodland trails. And I knew, with the kind of knowledge that settles in your bones like winter cold, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, even if I could no longer remember what that meant or why it felt so much like coming home. Story 6. The notification chimed at 3:27 a.m., cutting through the silence of my cramped Philadelphia apartment like a blade through skin. Your driver will arrive in 3 minutes. I should have been relieved. I'd been waiting for over 20 minutes in the suffocating heat of my broken air conditioner, sweat pooling in the small of my back as I paced the length of my living room. The job interview tomorrow morning was crucial, and I couldn't afford to be late. The last train had already departed, and this rideshare was my only lifeline. But relief didn't come. Instead, something cold crawled up my spine as I stared at the driver's profile photo, a grainy, almost pixelated image of a middle-aged man with eyes that seemed to stare directly through the screen. His name was listed simply as driver, and his rating showed a perfect 5 stars, though curiously, there were no written reviews beneath. The humid August air hit me like a wall as I stepped outside. Philadelphia's streets stretched empty in both directions, streetlights casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. The city that never slept appeared to be holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. A dark sedan materialized from the amber glow 3 blocks down, moving with an unsettling smoothness that made my stomach clench. As it approached, I noticed the headlights seemed dimmer than they should be, as if filtered through murky water. The car pulled up to the curb with barely a whisper, and I caught my first glimpse of the driver through the windshield. He matched the photo, but something was wrong with the proportions. His face appeared longer than it should be, stretched vertically like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. When he turned to look at me, his smile was too wide, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white in the dashboard's green glow. I slid into the back seat, the leather cold against my skin despite the oppressive heat outside. The car smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made my mouth water and my stomach revolt simultaneously. "Good morning," the driver said, his voice carrying a slight echo as if spoken from the bottom of a well. He didn't ask for my destination, though the app clearly showed I was heading to the airport. As we pulled away from the curb, I noticed the GPS screen was frozen. The little blue arrow that should have been tracking our progress sat motionless at the starting point, pointing in a direction that didn't match our actual heading. I leaned forward, about to mention it, when the driver's eyes found mine in the rearview mirror. They were completely black. Not brown, not dark. Black, like two holes punched through paper into an endless void. I blinked hard, certain the dim lighting was playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, they remained the same. Bottomless. Hungry. "The GPS seems to be," I began, but he cut me off with a slight shake of his head. "I know the way," he said, and there was that echo again, as if his words were bouncing off the walls of some vast, empty space I couldn't see. We turned left instead of right, away from the direct route to the airport that I'd memorized from countless previous trips. I pulled out my phone to check our location, but the screen showed no signal, not even emergency calls available. The battery indicator read 47%, though I was certain it had been above 80% just minutes before. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're going the wrong way. The airport is—" "Traffic," he interrupted, his eyes never leaving the road. "Bad traffic on the main route. This way is faster." But there was no traffic. The streets were completely deserted, so empty they felt apocalyptic. Not a single car, not a pedestrian, not even a stray cat. It was as if the entire city had been evacuated while I slept, leaving behind only empty shells of buildings and the two of us, trapped in this moving bubble of wrongness. We passed the same corner bodega 3 times. I was certain of it. The neon sign flickered in exactly the same pattern each time. Buzz, flash, steady, buzz. The same torn poster hung in the window, advertising a concert that had happened 2 months ago. The same crack ran down the sidewalk in front of it, shaped like a lightning bolt frozen in concrete. My hands began to shake. I pressed them against my thighs, trying to anchor myself to something real, something solid. The leather seat beneath me felt less substantial with each passing minute, as if it were slowly dissolving under my weight. "Where are we going?" I asked, no longer caring if I sounded frightened. The driver's head tilted slightly, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. Then, without warning, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, followed by the unmistakable sound of my own voice. But it wasn't just any recording. It was the voice message I'd sent to my sister just 4 hours earlier, explaining why I couldn't make it to her birthday dinner. Every word was exactly as I'd spoken it, every pause and inflection preserved with perfect clarity. But there was something else underneath. A rhythmic sound, soft and steady. Breathing. Someone else's breathing, slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring each word as it passed their lips. The recording played through to the end, and in the final moment of silence before I'd hung up, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A whispered voice, barely audible beneath the static. "I'm listening." The radio fell silent. I stared at the back of the driver's head, watching the way his shoulders rose and fell with each breath. The rhythm was identical to what I'd heard on the recording. "Stop the car," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. "Stop the car," I shouted, lunging forward to grab the back of his seat. My hand passed through him. For a split second, my fingers encountered nothing but cold air where his body should have been. Then, as if reality were reasserting itself, he solidified beneath my touch. But the brief moment of nothingness lingered in my palm like frostbite. "There's a gas station," he said calmly, as if nothing had happened. 24 hours. Up ahead. I saw it then, emerging from the darkness like a mirage. The bright fluorescent lights seemed harsh and garish after the dimness of the car, but they represented safety, normalcy, other people. I would get out there, call another ride, pretend this had never happened. The car glided to a stop near the pumps. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers slipping on the metal, as if it were coated in something viscous. When the door finally opened, the humid night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of gasoline and something else. Something that reminded me of old photographs and forgotten dreams. "Thank you," I mumbled, already stepping out, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was wearing the shape of a man behind the steering wheel. But as I reached the pavement, I heard him speak one final time. "See you soon, Michael." I spun around, but the car was already pulling away, its taillights fading into the distance with unnatural speed. The problem was, I had never told him my name. It wasn't displayed in the app, wasn't on any visible identification. He couldn't have known, unless he'd been listening for much longer than just tonight. Inside the gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting everything in sickly, strobing light. The clerk behind the counter looked up as I entered, his face pale and drawn as if he hadn't slept in days. "You okay, man?" he asked, studying my face with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to explain, to tell him about the driver and the car and the impossible things I'd witnessed. But when I pulled out my phone to show him the ride history, my blood ran cold. The app showed no record of any ride tonight. No driver, no trip, no charge to my credit card. According to the digital record, I had never left my apartment. But I was standing here, miles from home, in a gas station that according to my GPS didn't exist at this location. "How did I get here?" I whispered, more to myself than to the clerk. He frowned, glancing toward the empty parking lot beyond the windows. "You walked in from out there about 30 seconds ago. Didn't see how you got here before that." He paused, his expression growing more troubled. "But honestly, man, you're the first person I've seen all night. Been dead quiet for hours." I called a legitimate taxi, one from a company I'd used dozens of times before. The driver was reassuringly normal, middle-aged, slightly overweight, with a thick Philadelphia accent and opinions about the Eagles that he shared freely during the 20-minute ride back to my apartment. But as we pulled up to my building, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with fresh dread. There, in the passenger seat of a dark sedan parked across the street, was a silhouette. The profile was too familiar, the angle of the head too reminiscent of what I'd seen in the rearview mirror. Watching, waiting. I paid the taxi driver and hurried inside, not looking back until I reached my apartment. From my third-floor window, I could see the street below clearly. The dark sedan was gone. But on my phone, a new notification was waiting. "Your driver will arrive in 3 minutes." I hadn't requested a ride. With trembling fingers, I opened the app. There was no active trip, no pending reservation, but buried deep in the settings, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A recurring ride request, scheduled for 3:30 a.m. every morning, with a destination I'd never entered. Where you need to go. The driver's profile photo was the same grainy image from before, but now his eyes seemed to be looking directly at me through the screen. And beneath his name, where the rating should have been, was a single line of text that made my vision blur with terror. "Thank you for choosing us, Michael. Your ride never ends." I deleted the app immediately, but as I watched the icon disappear from my phone's screen, I could swear I heard the distant sound of an engine idling somewhere outside my window. The interview I was supposed to attend that morning seemed like a lifetime ago, a relic from a world where cause and effect still functioned according to recognizable rules. I called in sick, claiming food poisoning, though the nausea that rolled through me had nothing to do with anything I'd eaten. For 3 days, I refused to leave my apartment. I ordered groceries online, worked from home, made excuses to avoid any situation that might require transportation. But on the 4th night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone chimed. "Your driver will arrive in 3 minutes." The app was back on my phone, though I had no memory of downloading it again. The profile was the same, the destination unchanged. Where you need to go. I threw the phone across the room, but I could still hear it chiming. Again and again, the same notification, as regular as a heartbeat. Your driver will arrive in 3 minutes. Your driver will arrive in 3 minutes. Your driver will arrive in 3 minutes. And somewhere in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, I could hear the whisper-quiet hum of an engine that never needed fuel, never needed rest, never needed anything except the next passenger foolish enough to climb into its back seat. The worst part isn't the fear anymore. It's the growing certainty that one night, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear and the walls of my apartment feel like a prison, I'll find myself walking down to the street at 3:30 a.m. and he'll be waiting. Because some rides, once begun, never truly end. They just circle back again and again through streets that exist only in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between what we know and what we fear to discover. The app is still on my phone. I've stopped trying to delete it. After all, everyone needs to get somewhere eventually, and he knows exactly where I need to go. Story 7. The first thing you need to understand about photographing the dead is that they never truly rest in New England. The granite refuses to forget, the marble holds memories like a sponge holds water, and the earth beneath your feet remembers every soul that's ever been pressed into its embrace. I learned this on a Tuesday in October, when the afternoon light slanted through bare branches at just the right angle to make shadows look like doorways. I'd driven up from Boston with my camera equipment, chasing a commission from New England Architecture Quarterly, something about Victorian funerary art and the craftsmanship of 19th century stonemasons. Easy money, I thought. Point, shoot, collect the check. The Woodlawn Cemetery in Salem had all the right elements: towering obelisks, elaborate mausoleums with intricate ironwork, and enough Gothic revival architecture to satisfy any magazine editor's appetite for atmospheric photography. The afternoon had that peculiar quality that October afternoons possess in Massachusetts, crisp enough to see your breath, but warm enough in the patches of sunlight to make you forget winter was coming. I worked methodically, capturing the play of light across weathered stone, the way moss crept up the sides of monuments like green fingers reaching toward heaven. The cemetery was larger than I'd expected, sprawling across several acres of rolling hills dotted with ancient maples and oaks that had probably witnessed more burials than I cared to contemplate. It was near the older section, where the stones leaned at odd angles, and the inscriptions had been worn smooth by decades of New England weather, that I found the Holloway Mausoleum. The structure stood apart from the others, not just physically, but in some intangible way that made my camera feel heavier in my hands. Built from what appeared to be Carrara marble, its surfaces gleamed with an almost oily sheen despite the overcast sky. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Carved roses and ivy wound around Corinthian columns, and cherubs' faces peered down from the corners of the roof with expressions that seemed more knowing than peaceful. Above the bronze door, the name Holloway was cut deep into the stone, the letters filled with what looked like recent gold leaf that caught the dying light. But it was the door itself that drew me closer. Unlike the other mausoleums I'd photographed, this one stood slightly ajar. I approached with the casual curiosity of someone who spends too much time alone with old stones and older stories. The gap was narrow, perhaps 6 inches, but wide enough to let in the afternoon air. Wide enough, I realized as I drew nearer, to let other things in as well. The first step onto the marble threshold felt wrong. Not wrong in any way I could immediately articulate, but wrong in the way your body knows something before your mind catches up. The stone beneath my foot didn't just echo, it resonated, as if the marble were merely a thin shell over some vast, empty space. The sound that came back wasn't the solid thunk you'd expect from stepping on several inches of stone, but rather a hollow, almost musical note that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. I lifted my foot and set it down again, harder this time. The same hollow ring, but now I could feel it as much as hear it. A vibration that traveled up through my bones and settled somewhere in my chest like a tuning fork struck against my ribs. The temperature dropped. I don't mean it got chilly. I mean the air around me plummeted at least 15 degrees in the span of a heartbeat, as if I'd stepped into an invisible refrigerator. My breath, which had been invisible moments before, suddenly plumed out in thick white clouds that hung in the air with unnatural persistence. But here's where it gets strange, where it gets impossible. My breath didn't dissipate the way breath should. Instead, it formed these perfectly straight lines in the air, geometric patterns that looked almost architectural in their precision. As I exhaled, the condensation traced what appeared to be the outline of something, corners and edges, straight lines and right angles, as if my breath were being molded around an invisible framework. I stepped back instinctively, my photographer's brain trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Temperature differential, I told myself. Microclimates, some kind of atmospheric condition unique to this spot. But even as I retreated from the threshold, backing away slowly with my eyes fixed on those impossible breath patterns, another sound began. A gentle chiming, rhythmic and melodic, like wind chimes made of stone. I looked up, scanning the roof of the mausoleum for some logical source of the sound, but found only those cherub faces staring down at me with what now seemed like amusement. The chiming continued, regular as a heartbeat, and only when I looked down did I locate its source. A slate marker, perhaps 2 feet tall and weather-worn to illegibility, stood slightly off-kilter near the mausoleum's left corner. As I watched, it swayed gently back and forth, just enough to strike the marble base with each oscillation. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but consistent, and there was no wind. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching this impossibly balanced stone sway and chime, while my breath continued to trace geometric patterns in the frigid air around the mausoleum's entrance. Everything about the scene violated basic principles of physics, yet there it was, happening with the casual indifference of reality. The smart thing would have been to leave. Pack up my equipment, drive back to Boston, find a different cemetery for the article. Instead, I raised my camera and started shooting. The photographs came out perfectly. Too perfectly, in fact. Every detail was crisp. Every shadow fell exactly where it should have, and the lighting had that golden quality that photographers spend years trying to achieve. But when I reviewed the images later that evening in my hotel room, I noticed something that made my hands shake as I held the camera. In every single photograph of the Holloway Mausoleum, there was something else in the frame, not visible to the naked eye, but caught by the camera's digital sensor, a series of faint lines and angles that seemed to hover just above the marble surface, like the blueprint of some invisible structure overlaying the mausoleum itself. I deleted the photos, all of them. I told myself they were corrupted files, a malfunction of the camera's sensor, light pollution from some nearby source I hadn't noticed. I drove back to Boston that night instead of staying over as planned, and I didn't look back at the cemetery even once in my rearview mirror. The white powder appeared 3 days later. I woke up that Friday morning with the strangest sensation in my left foot. Not pain exactly, but a kind of numbness, as if the soul had gone to sleep. When I pulled back the covers and looked down, I found a fine white dust covering the bottom of my foot in a perfect grid pattern. The powder was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had the consistency of talc, but didn't behave like any normal substance. When I tried to brush it off, it simply shifted around, maintaining its geometric pattern. When I stood up and walked to the bathroom, it didn't transfer to the floor, didn't leave footprints or traces. It stayed exactly where it was, forming these precise squares across the sole of my left foot, like the ventilation grate of some subterranean machine. I scrubbed it off in the shower, used soap and a pumice stone, watched it spiral down the drain in cloudy spirals. But when I woke up the next morning, it was back. Same pattern, same consistency, same impossible adherence to my skin and nowhere else. The nights became the worst part. Sleep, when it came at all, brought dreams that weren't quite dreams. I would find myself standing in vast underground chambers, ceilingless spaces that stretched away into darkness. The walls were white marble, shot through with veins of something that might have been gold or might have been something else entirely. And everywhere, the sound of chiming, not the gentle rhythm I'd heard at the cemetery, but a complex symphony of tones, as if thousands of those slate markers were swaying in perfect unison somewhere just beyond my vision. I would wake from these experiences. I refused to call them dreams. with my left foot burning cold, the white powder arranged in new patterns. Sometimes it looked like a map, sometimes like architectural blueprints, sometimes like nothing more than random geometric shapes that nonetheless felt deeply, terrifyingly significant. I tried everything. Different shoes, different socks, sleeping with my feet outside the covers, sleeping with them wrapped in plastic bags. Nothing prevented the powder's appearance. Nothing disturbed its perfect adherence to my skin. It was as if something beneath the world had claimed that small patch of my body as its own territory, marking it nightly with symbols I couldn't read, but somehow understood. The paranoia crept in gradually, the way fog rolls in from the ocean, so slowly you don't notice it until you're completely enveloped. I began checking the locks on my apartment multiple times each night. I installed motion sensors, security cameras, even had the building super check for gas leaks, electromagnetic anomalies, anything that might explain the physical sensations I was experiencing. But late at night, lying in bed with my feet bare and my mind racing, I knew the truth was simpler and more terrible than any scientific explanation. I had stepped into something at that cemetery, crossed some threshold that existed in the space between the marble floor and the hollow echo beneath it, and whatever I had disturbed there had followed me home. The white powder wasn't just appearing on my foot, it was appearing from my foot, emerging from somewhere deeper than skin, deeper than bone, from some underground place I had briefly connected with when I stood on that marble threshold and felt the emptiness beneath. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom after the 7th night, started camping out on the living room couch with all the lights on, telling myself I was conducting an experiment, observing the phenomenon from a safe distance. But distance, I was learning, was irrelevant when the thing tracking you existed in the space between spaces, in the hollow echo that lives beneath solid ground. The maps the powder formed became increasingly detailed. Street grids, architectural plans, complex three-dimensional diagrams that hurt to look at directly, and always, at the center of each formation, a small square that corresponded exactly to the location of the Holloway Mausoleum. I researched the cemetery's history, diving deep into property records and genealogical databases. The Holloway family had owned significant real estate in Salem during the late 1800s, including several commercial buildings and what appeared to be a small network of underground tunnels used for storage during Prohibition. The tunnels, according to one 1923 city planning document, had been sealed off and filled with concrete after a series of structural collapses. But sealed doesn't mean gone, and filled doesn't mean empty. I realized, with the slow dawning horror of someone who has spent too many nights staring at impossible patterns on their skin, that the hollow echo I'd heard beneath the mausoleum floor wasn't the sound of empty space. It was the sound of connected space, tunnels and chambers and pathways that stretched beneath Salem like a second city, a mirror image of the world above ground, where the dead had more room to move than anyone had imagined. 3 weeks after my visit to the cemetery, I made a decision that I still can't fully explain. I drove back to Salem. The cemetery looked different in November, smaller somehow, as if the bare trees and gray sky had compressed it into something less substantial than I remembered. The Holloway Mausoleum stood exactly as I'd left it, marble gleaming dully in the overcast light, door still standing slightly ajar. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The gap in the door wasn't a gap at all, it was an invitation. The hollow echo beneath the marble wasn't emptiness, it was expectation. And the white powder that appeared on my foot each morning wasn't a mark or a sign, it was a key. I approached the mausoleum with steady steps, my left foot tingling with anticipation. The marble threshold felt solid this time, no hollow echo, no resonance. But when I looked down at my shoe, I could see the white powder seeping through the leather, forming its familiar grid pattern on the sole as if responding to proximity to its source. The door swung open at my touch, revealing not the interior of a mausoleum, but a descending staircase carved from the same white marble, leading down into darkness that seemed to possess its own weight. The walls were lined with what looked like ventilation grates, perfect squares of shadow that matched, with terrifying precision, the patterns that had been appearing on my foot. I stood there at the threshold, feeling the cold air rising from below, carrying with it the sound of distant chiming and the scent of something that might have been limestone or might have been bones ground to powder. Everything rational in my mind screamed for me to turn around, to run, to seek help from people who dealt with problems that had solutions. But the white powder on my foot was warm now, almost burning, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I had never really had a choice in this matter. From the moment I first stepped on that marble threshold and heard the hollow echo beneath, I had been following a path that led inevitably to this moment, this door, this decision. The last thing I remember clearly is the sound my footsteps made on the marble stairs. Not the hollow echo I'd expected, but a solid rhythmic chiming, as if the stone itself were welcoming me home. Each step down revealed new patterns in the walls, geometric designs that hurt to look at directly but felt familiar, like a language I'd once spoken fluently but had forgotten until now. I want to tell you what I found at the bottom of those stairs. I want to describe the chambers that opened up like flowers made of marble and shadow, the way the white powder streamed from my foot to join similar patterns on the walls and ceiling, forming connection points in a vast network that stretched beneath New England like neural pathways in some geological brain. But the truth is, I'm not entirely sure I ever came back up. I'm writing this in what I believe to be my apartment, on what appears to be my computer, but the white powder never stops flowing now. It covers my entire left foot, climbing up my ankle in spirals that form new patterns each day. The chiming is constant, not audible exactly, but felt in my bones, a rhythm that synchronizes with my heartbeat until I can't tell where the sound ends and my pulse begins. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other people in mirrors or reflective surfaces, pale figures standing behind me, watching with the patient attention of those who have learned to exist in spaces between spaces. They don't seem hostile, these observers. If anything, they appear relieved, as if they've been waiting a very long time for someone to join their underground communion. The hardest part isn't the uncertainty about what's real and what isn't. The hardest part is the growing suspicion that I've been asking the wrong question entirely. The question isn't whether any of this is really happening. The question is whether it ever stopped. The gravel crunched and yanked beneath my pickup's tires as I pulled into the abandoned lot, headlights sweeping across the skeletal remains of the old observation tower. 3 months of insomnia had driven me here, to this forgotten corner of Missouri where light pollution couldn't chase away the darkness I desperately needed to see clearly. The Perseid meteor shower peaked tonight, and Dr. Reeves had suggested stargazing might help reset my circadian rhythm. What he hadn't suggested was driving 200 miles to a decommissioned fire lookout that most people had forgotten existed. I killed the engine and immediately felt the weight of silence press against my eardrums. No highway hum, no neighbor's television bleeding through apartment walls, no air conditioning units cycling on and off. Just the soft tick of cooling metal and my own breathing, unnaturally loud in the cab. The tower loomed 40 feet above, its metal framework etched against a canvas of stars that seemed impossibly bright after months of city living. I'd discovered this place through an obscure astronomy forum, a hidden gem where serious stargazers went to escape civilization's glow. The few grainy photos posted online showed sweeping views of rolling hills and an unobstructed dome of sky. I grabbed my thermos of coffee and settled back against the truck's bench seat, rolling down both windows to let in the August night air. It carried scents I'd almost forgotten: wild grass, creek water, and something faintly metallic that might have been the tower's aging steel. The pickup's bench seat had enough room for me to stretch out, and I'd packed a pillow and blanket for what I hoped would be hours of peaceful meteor watching. Above, the Milky Way stretched like spilled milk across black velvet. I hadn't seen it this clearly since childhood camping trips with my father, before the world became bright screens and fluorescent anxiety. The first meteor streaked overhead within minutes, a brilliant green flash that lasted less than a second, but left after images dancing behind my eyelids. Then came the second, and third. The shower was everything the astronomy websites had promised. Each celestial ember seemed to burn away a little of the tension that had been building in my shoulders for months. My breathing slowed, deepened. For the first time since the promotion to regional manager, with its impossible deadlines and constant travel, I felt something approaching peace. The first knock came at 11:47 p.m. 4 measured raps against the driver's side panel, precise as a woodpecker but deeper, more resonant. I jerked upright, pulse immediately hammering. The sound had been deliberate, purposeful, not the random impact of a falling branch or startled animal. I waited, counting heartbeats in the silence. Nothing. Another meteor flashed overhead, but I barely noticed. Every nerve ending had suddenly sharpened to hyper-awareness. The darkness beyond my windows seemed to have thickened, pressed closer. I could no longer see the outline of bushes that had been visible moments before. 4 more knocks. These came from the passenger side, the same measured rhythm, the same purposeful tone. As if someone, or something, had circled to the opposite side of the truck while I sat frozen. My hand found the flashlight on the dashboard, fingers trembling slightly as I clicked it on. The LED beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but low brush and scattered stones. I played the light in a slow circle around the truck, methodically examining every shadow, every potential hiding place. Empty. Nothing larger than a rabbit could have concealed itself in the sparse vegetation. The knocking resumed before I'd finished the sweep. 4 beats from behind the cab this time, vibrating through the truck bed's metal floor. I spun in my seat, flashlight beam dancing wildly, but found only my camping gear and a cooler secured with bungee cords. 4 beats. Pause, then 4 more from the front bumper. Whatever was circling my truck moved with impossible stealth across ground that should have betrayed every footstep with crunching gravel and rustling grass. I'd hunted enough as a teenager to know that even deer made noise moving through undergrowth. My mouth had gone bone dry. I reached for the thermos with a shaking hand, needing the anchor of familiar routine, but stopped when I realized the coffee's surface was trembling in perfect concentric rings, not from my movement, from vibrations in the truck itself. The knocking pattern continued its circuit. Driver's side, passenger side, rear, front, then starting over. Always 4 beats with mathematical precision, always the same resonant tone that seemed to come from inside the metal rather than impact from outside. Each cycle took exactly 37 seconds. I found myself counting, timing it with the digital clock on the dashboard. By the 5th circuit, I noticed something else. The rhythm matched my heartbeat perfectly. Not approximately, perfectly. When my pulse quickened with mounting fear, the knocks accelerated. When I forced myself to breathe deeply, trying to slow my racing heart, the intervals between beats lengthened accordingly. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, needing to capture proof of what was happening. The recording app took precious seconds to load, seconds during which the knocking continued its relentless circuit. When I finally hit record, holding the phone toward the driver's side window, the knocks stopped. Complete silence. Even the normal night sounds, crickets, distant owls, the whisper of wind through grass, had vanished. The world had been wrapped in cotton, muffled beyond reason. I waited, phone extended, recording nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. 2 minutes passed. 3. The silence stretched so long that I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire episode. Stress-induced auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon. Dr. Reeves had mentioned them during our last session. Then the knocking resumed, and I nearly dropped the phone. But now the rhythm had changed. Instead of matching my resting heartbeat, the beats synchronized with my actual pulse in real time. When anxiety spiked my heart rate, the knocks immediately accelerated. When I held my breath, testing the impossible connection, the knocks created syncopated patterns, filling the spaces where heartbeats should have been. The recording app showed steady input levels, confirming that the phone was picking up the sounds. This wasn't hallucination. The evidence glowed on the screen in fluctuating green bars. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Maybe temperature changes in the truck's metal body were causing expansion and contraction. Maybe a bird had become trapped somewhere in the undercarriage. Maybe the combination of isolation, insomnia, and medication side effects was creating elaborate delusions. But none of those explanations accounted for the perfect synchronization with my cardiovascular system. The knocking stopped again, this time when I pulled up Dr. Reeves's contact information. I'd promised to call if the anxiety attacks returned, but how could I explain this? How could I describe sounds that seemed to emanate from my own biological rhythms? The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes, long enough for me to consider starting the engine and driving home. Long enough to wonder if the entire episode had been some kind of stress-induced break from reality. But as I reached for the ignition key, condensation began forming on the inside of the windshield. This made no sense. The temperature differential between inside and outside the cab wasn't significant enough to cause fogging, and moisture should have formed on the outside surface where cooler night air met glass warmed by my body heat. Instead, droplets appeared on the interior surface in a pattern too geometric for random condensation. Straight lines connected by precise angles, emerging from nothing as if drawn by an invisible finger. A pentagon. Then a second pentagon within the first, inverted to create intersecting lines. A perfect pentagram, formed by condensation that had no natural explanation, appearing on the inside of glass I hadn't touched. I sat transfixed, watching the symbol complete itself with mathematical precision. Each line appeared in deliberate sequence, moisture beading and flowing to create geometries that defied the random distribution of water vapor. The recording app was still running. I pointed the phone's camera at the windshield, capturing the impossible formation as it solidified. The pentagram reflected the truck's interior lights, casting fragmented star shapes across the dashboard. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely operate the phone. Every rational part of my mind rejected what I was seeing, but the evidence glowed on the windshield's surface. Moisture continued to bead and flow in perfect straight lines, defying physics and logic with equal contempt. The knocking resumed. But now it came from directly overhead, from the truck's roof. 4 beats in perfect synchronization with my terrified heartbeat, which was now racing at over 100 beats per minute. The impacts resonated through the cab's metal frame, vibrating the seat springs and rattling the dashboard. I couldn't see what was on the roof, couldn't aim the flashlight upward through the cab's solid ceiling. But I could feel weight pressing down, distributed mass that made the truck's suspension creak slightly with each impact. The recording showed consistent audio input. Whatever was happening wasn't purely psychological. The phone's sensors confirmed external sounds, external forces acting on physical matter. But that knowledge brought no comfort. The knocking pattern shifted again. Instead of 4 beats and pause, it began playing complex rhythms that seemed almost musical. Syncopated patterns that complemented my heartbeat, rather than simply matching it, as if something was learning, adapting, composing increasingly sophisticated percussion pieces using my cardiovascular system as the bass track. I reached for the ignition with desperate urgency, no longer caring about evidence or explanations. The engine cranked once, twice, then caught with a reassuring rumble. Headlights blazed to life, flooding the surrounding area with yellow light that revealed exactly what I'd seen before. Empty brush, scattered stones, the skeletal tower rising into star-filled darkness. Nothing on the ground, nothing in the air, nothing that could explain the weight I'd felt pressing down on the truck's roof. I threw the transmission into reverse without checking mirrors, desperate to escape whatever had turned this peaceful stargazing spot into a theater of impossible phenomena. Gravel sprayed as the truck lurched backward, tires fighting for traction on the loose surface. In the rearview mirror, the tower dwindled quickly, but the pentagram remained perfectly visible on the windshield's interior surface, its edges still sharp despite the truck's movement. Condensation shouldn't have maintained that kind of geometric precision while the vehicle bounced over rough ground. I didn't slow down until I reached the county highway, pavement solid beneath the tires and familiar yellow lines marking the edges of normal reality. Only then did I pull over, hands still trembling as I examined the phone's recordings. The audio file showed 43 minutes of clear knocking sounds, perfectly synchronized with what I remembered experiencing. The video of the pentagram formation was equally clear, moisture appearing from nowhere to create impossible geometries on glass that remained untouched by human hands. But when I looked up at the windshield itself, the surface was completely clear. No condensation, no geometric patterns, no trace of the symbol that had been perfectly visible moments before. I drove the remaining 150 miles home in a state of numb confusion, radio playing soft jazz to fill the silence that felt too dangerous to tolerate. The recordings remained on my phone, solid evidence of phenomena that defied rational explanation. But the physical traces had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Dr. Reeves listened to my account with professional patience, occasionally taking notes but never interrupting. When I finished, he asked to hear the audio recording. We sat in his office for nearly an hour, playing back the knocking sounds through his computer speakers. The file contained 43 minutes of my own breathing, and nothing else. No knocks, no rhythmic patterns, no synchronized percussion that had seemed so undeniably real in the darkness beside that abandoned tower. I showed him the video of the pentagram formation, but the phone's screen displayed only shaky footage of an empty windshield. No condensation, no geometric patterns, no impossible moisture defying the laws of physics. Dr. Reeves suggested increasing my medication dosage and scheduling more frequent sessions. He spoke carefully about stress-induced hallucinations and the mind's capacity for creating elaborate sensory experiences under extreme exhaustion. His explanations were reasonable, professional, grounded in decades of clinical experience. But he couldn't explain why my truck's odometer showed an extra 400 miles that I definitely remembered driving. He couldn't account for the gravel still embedded in the tire treads, or the fine layer of Missouri dust coating the vehicle's undercarriage. Most troubling of all, he couldn't explain why I'd found my phone plugged into the truck's charging port the next morning, despite clearly remembering leaving it on the dashboard beside my keys. The astronomy forum where I'd discovered the Missouri Tower location no longer existed. The URL led to a domain registration page. The few online references I'd used to find the site had vanished from search results as if they'd never been indexed. But sometimes, late at night when insomnia returned with familiar weight, I could still hear the knocking. 4 beats, pause, 4 more, always in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat, always maintaining the rhythm that something had learned by listening to the most intimate percussion of my own mortality. The recordings showed nothing. The evidence had evaporated, but the memory remained, precise as a pentagram drawn in condensation that shouldn't have existed. And sometimes, when I caught my reflection in bathroom mirrors or storefront windows, I could swear I saw geometric patterns traced in the fog of my own breathing. Perfect pentagrams that appeared for just a moment before physics reasserted itself, and random moisture replaced impossible symmetry. Dr. Reeves would say this was textbook anxiety manifestation, the mind creating patterns where none existed. He would adjust dosages and schedule additional sessions, and speak reassuringly about the brain's remarkable capacity for self-deception under stress. But he'd never sat in a pickup truck beside an abandoned Missouri tower, listening to something circle in the darkness while learning the rhythm of a human heart. He'd never watched condensation form pentagrams on the inside of glass that no hand had touched. And he'd never driven home with recordings that documented phenomena that couldn't be replayed, evidence that existed only in the moment of experience before reality reclaimed its territory and relegated the impossible back to the realm of dreams and delusion. The medication helped with sleep, but it couldn't erase the certainty that something had responded to my presence that night. Something that understood rhythm and geometry and the precise mathematics of human fear, something that might still be listening, even now, to the steady percussion of my heartbeat as I typed these words in a well-lit apartment 200 miles from any abandoned tower. 4 beats, pause, 4 more. The rhythm that never quite leaves me alone. Story 9. The Forest Service radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., 3 short bursts of static that meant nothing to anyone else but always made my skin crawl. I'd been stationed at Lookout Point for 6 weeks now, long enough to know that radios didn't just turn themselves on, and long enough to understand that the wilderness around this particular outpost held secrets that daylight couldn't quite burn away. I was updating fire hazard reports when Sarah's voice drifted through the night air outside my cabin. clear as glass despite the wind that had been building all evening. She called my nickname, Crow, the way she always did, with that slight upturn at the end that made it sound almost like a question. The words that followed were unmistakably hers. Crow, I need help with these maps. Can you give me a hand? My pen stopped mid-sentence. Sarah Chen was my partner on this rotation, a veteran ranger with 15 years in the service who knew these mountains better than the wildlife that called them home. But something about her voice made the hair on my arms stand up. Some quality I couldn't quite identify that felt wrong in a way that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the primitive part of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey. The deck outside groaned under footsteps, the weathered boards singing their familiar song of complaint. I knew every sound this place made. The third board from the door that wheezed like an old man's chest, the railing post that whistled when the wind hit it just right, the way the corner near the equipment shed would pop and crack when the temperature dropped. These were her footsteps, I was certain. The rhythm was right, the weight distribution exactly what I'd heard dozens of times before. But when I opened the door, the deck stretched empty before me like an accusation. The motion sensor light had triggered, casting harsh white illumination across the wooden planks, and I could see everything clearly. No one was there. Yet the boards continued to creak and settle, following the same pattern they would if someone were walking across them, pausing near the railing where Sarah always leaned when she was thinking through a problem. I stepped outside, barefoot on the cold wood, and felt the phantom weight of another person's presence so strongly that I turned around twice, expecting to find someone standing just outside my peripheral vision. The wind carried the smell of pine sap and distant smoke, but underneath it was something else. A scent I couldn't place but that reminded me unpleasantly of the musty corners of old houses where things had been left to decay. Sarah? I called into the darkness beyond the light's reach. The response came from somewhere off to my left, near the equipment shed where we kept the extra radio gear and emergency supplies. Same voice, same cadence, but the words came with pauses in all the wrong places, like someone had recorded her speaking and then spliced the audio together without understanding the natural rhythm of human speech. Crow, I need help with these maps. Can you give me a hand? The breaks fell between words that should have flowed together, and there was something mechanical about the breathing. Too regular, too calculated. Real people didn't breathe like metronomes when they were asking for help in the middle of the night. I grabbed my flashlight from the hook by the door and swept it across the area where the voice had originated. The beam caught nothing but familiar shadows cast by equipment I'd seen every day for weeks. But as I stood there, the light wavering slightly in my unsteady grip, the voice came again, this time from the opposite direction. Crow, I need help with these maps. Exactly the same words, exactly the same inflection, but now coming from near the fire tower access trail. I spun toward the sound, my light dancing across tree branches that seemed to writhe in the shifting illumination like arthritic fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. This was when the rational part of my mind started offering explanations. Sarah could be playing some kind of elaborate joke, though that would be wildly out of character for her. Or maybe she'd gotten turned around in the darkness and was genuinely lost, her voice carrying strangely on the wind. Sound did funny things in mountain terrain, especially at night when temperature inversions could bounce voices off invisible layers of air like acoustic ping-pong balls. But even as I tried to convince myself of these logical possibilities, a deeper understanding was taking root in my gut. The kind of knowledge that comes from millions of years of evolution teaching humans to recognize when they're in the presence of something that isn't quite right, isn't quite safe, isn't quite what it appears to be. I retreated to the cabin and locked the door, though I couldn't have explained why. We rarely locked doors out here. There was no one around for miles except other Forest Service personnel, and we all looked out for each other. But standing there with my back against the solid wood, I felt like a child again, afraid of the monster under the bed, but somehow knowing that this time the monster might actually be real. The temperature in the cabin had dropped noticeably since I'd gone outside, though I hadn't left the door open long enough for that to make sense. My breath wasn't quite visible, but almost, and the papers on my desk rustled as if touched by a breeze that had no source. I checked the windows, all closed and latched. The heating system hummed along normally, pushing warm air through the vents with its usual mechanical diligence. I tried to return to my reports, but the words on the page seemed to shift and blur whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. The numbers in the grid kept rearranging themselves into patterns that looked almost like faces, and I had to blink hard several times to make them behave like proper digits again. That's when I heard the tapping on the window. It started soft, almost tentative, like someone testing whether the glass was solid. A gentle finger tap rhythm that could have been a branch moved by the wind, except that the nearest tree was a good 10 feet from that particular window, and its branches were too thin to reach the cabin even in a gale. The tapping moved along the window frame, tracing a deliberate pattern. When I looked toward the sound, I could see the glass fogging up in a rough rectangular shape, as if someone were breathing on it from the outside. But the fog wasn't forming randomly. It was taking the shape of something specific, something familiar. My service badge. Someone or something was drawing the outline of my Forest Service identification badge on the window glass, complete with the correct proportions and the little clip at the top where it attached to my uniform shirt. The detail was precise. Too precise for coincidence. Too accurate for someone who had only glimpsed the badge casually. I approached the window slowly, my flashlight beam trembling as badly as my hands. The fogged area was clearing now, but I could still see the faint outline where it had been, like a ghostly afterimage burned into my retinas. I pressed my face close to the glass and peered out into the darkness, but my own reflection stared back at me, distorted and strange in the double-pane surface. The tapping resumed, this time moving to the window beside my desk. Same rhythm, same deliberate quality, but now it seemed to be spelling something out. 3 short taps, 3 long ones, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code, repeated over and over with mechanical precision. My radio crackled again, and this time Sarah's voice came through the speaker, clear as if she were sitting right next to me. But the words she spoke made my blood freeze in my veins. Base station, this is Ranger Chen reporting from Meadowbrook Station. Everything's normal here. I'm settling in for the night. No assistance needed. Meadowbrook Station was 40 miles away, connected to our communication network, but serving a completely different section of the forest. If Sarah was there, if she'd been there all night, then who had been calling to me from outside my cabin? I grabbed the radio with shaking hands and keyed the microphone. Sarah, this is Crow at Lookout Point. Can you confirm your location? The response came immediately, in Sarah's familiar no-nonsense tone. Lookout Point, this is Chen. I'm at Meadowbrook, have been since 1800 hours. Weather report showed potential electrical activity in your sector tonight. You doing okay up there? The professional concern in her voice was absolutely genuine, and that's what made it so terrifying. This was really Sarah, the Sarah I knew, speaking to me from 40 miles away, which meant that whatever had been outside my cabin, whatever had been calling my name and asking for help with maps, had not been Sarah at all. I'm fine, I managed to say, though my voice cracked on the words. Just thought I heard something outside. Could be elk, Sarah suggested. They've been pretty active in that area lately, moving down from the higher elevations with the weather changing. Sometimes their calls can sound almost human, especially at night. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to accept the rational explanation and chalk the whole experience up to isolation, fatigue, and the well-documented ability of the human brain to create patterns and meaning from random sensory input. But elk didn't draw badges on windows, and they certainly didn't mimic specific human voices with such uncanny accuracy. After signing off with Sarah, I sat in my chair and tried to make sense of what was happening. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closer together, as if the building itself were slowly contracting around me. Every small sound, the settling of the foundation, the whisper of air through the vents, the distant howl of wind through the trees, seemed amplified and threatening. I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows obsessively, even though I knew they were secure. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that there was nothing out there, that I was letting my imagination run wild in the way that people do when they're alone in remote places for too long. But some deeper instinct, some primitive survival mechanism that had kept my ancestors alive in dangerous times, was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. The tapping returned around 2 in the morning, but this time it came from multiple windows simultaneously, as if several people were standing outside the cabin, all trying to get my attention at once. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, but there was something profoundly wrong about the timing. It was too regular, too perfect, like a machine trying to simulate human behavior, but getting the details slightly off. I turned off all the lights in the cabin and waited in the darkness, hoping that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. But the tapping continued, and now I could hear other sounds too. Footsteps circling the building, the creak of the deck boards, the soft scrape of something being dragged across the ground. Most disturbing of all was the voice, Sarah's voice, which had returned and was now coming from different directions in rapid succession, as if she were running around the cabin at impossible speed. The words were always the same. "Crow, I need help with these maps. Can you give me a hand?" But the delivery was becoming increasingly mechanical, increasingly wrong. Sometimes the words would overlap, as if multiple Sarahs were speaking in unison. Sometimes they would come in reverse order, or with long, unnatural pauses between syllables. Once, the voice spoke the words backwards, each sound perfectly articulated, but in completely the wrong sequence, creating a linguistic abomination that made my skin crawl. I tried calling Sarah again on the radio, but got only static. Either atmospheric conditions were interfering with transmission, or something else was blocking the signal. The isolation felt complete now, total, as if I had been cut off from the entire world and left alone with whatever was circling my cabin like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. By dawn, the sounds had stopped, but I didn't dare go outside to investigate. I waited until full daylight, until I could see clearly in all directions, before finally opening the door and stepping onto the deck. There were no footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, no signs that anyone had been there at all. The windows showed no evidence of the fogging or the traced patterns I'd seen so clearly the night before. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it had when I'd arrived at the station weeks ago. But when I walked around to the back of the cabin, I found something that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Pressed into the soft dirt beneath the window where I'd heard the first tapping were prints that might have been footprints, if footprints could be made by something that had no feet. The impressions were roughly the right size and shape, but they looked as if they'd been formed by something that was only pretending to walk, something that understood the concept of footprints, but not the physics of how they were actually made. The prints led away from the cabin in a straight line, directly toward the forest. But instead of the irregular spacing and slight angle variations that real walking would produce, these marks were perfectly aligned, exactly the same distance apart, as if made by a machine programmed to simulate human locomotion, but lacking the subtle imperfections that would make it convincing. I followed the trail for about 50 yards before it simply stopped. Not at a creek or a rocky patch where tracks might naturally disappear, but in the middle of an open area of soft ground where any real person would have left clear, deep impressions. The prints just ended, as if whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist at that precise spot. Standing there in the morning sunlight, looking at those impossible tracks, I had to face the possibility that I was losing my mind. Isolation could do strange things to people, and I'd been alone at the station longer than usual due to staffing shortages. Maybe my brain was manufacturing threats to give my hypervigilant survival instincts something to focus on. Maybe the voice, the tapping, the footprints, maybe all of it was just my subconscious mind's way of creating drama in an environment that was otherwise monotonously safe. But as I turned to walk back to the cabin, I heard it one more time. Sarah's voice, calling my name from somewhere deep in the trees behind me. This time, though, it sounded different. Sad, maybe, or desperate, like something that had been trying all night to communicate with me and was finally giving up. "Crow," the voice said, and for just a moment it sounded perfectly, heartbreakingly human. "I need help." I didn't turn around. I didn't look back. I walked to my cabin, packed my gear, and called for emergency extraction, citing a family emergency that didn't exist. Within 6 hours, I was off the mountain, replaced by another ranger who would spend the next few weeks in that isolated station. alone with whatever lived in the woods around Lookout Point. I never asked him if he heard anything unusual during his rotation. Some questions are better left unasked, and some answers are too dangerous to know. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I still hear Sarah's voice calling my name, asking for help with maps she'll never need, in a voice that was never quite her own. The Forest Service psychologist said it was textbook isolation syndrome, complicated by sleep deprivation and the natural human tendency to anthropomorphize random sounds. The medical evaluation found nothing wrong with me beyond elevated stress hormones and mild dehydration. My supervisor was understanding, even sympathetic. These things happened sometimes in remote postings, and I wasn't the first ranger to request early rotation due to what the official report termed environmental stressor response. But late at night, when I'm lying in my bed in town, safe behind locked doors and surrounded by the familiar sounds of civilization, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd opened that door one more time. If I'd stepped outside and tried to help whatever was calling my name in Sarah's voice, asking for assistance with maps that might have shown territories no human was ever meant to explore. I wonder, but I'm grateful I'll never know for sure. Story 10. The first thing I noticed about the rental house on Maple Street wasn't the peeling paint or the overgrown hedges. It was how the silence felt intentional. Not empty, but waiting, like a held breath behind a closed door. I'd moved to Ohio for the job transfer, 3 states away from everything familiar, and this place was all I could afford on short notice. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had seemed eager to rent it, almost too eager, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the keys. She'd mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving abruptly, but the words got lost in the echo of my footsteps across the hardwood floors. The house settled around me that first week, like an old coat finding its shape. Every creak and whisper of wind through the eaves felt like conversation I wasn't quite hearing. I told myself it was normal. Old houses talk. Everyone knows that. The 1940s Craftsman had character, with its built-in shelving and original fixtures. The chandelier in the dining room was particularly striking, a crystal cascade that caught light in ways that seemed almost deliberate. It was on Tuesday, exactly 1 week after I'd signed the lease, that the salesman appeared. I was unpacking books in the living room when the doorbell rang, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. Through the peephole, I saw a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit, holding a clipboard and wearing the practiced smile of someone who'd perfected the art of interruption. "Good afternoon, sir. Tom Mitchell from Guardian Power Solutions. I noticed you just moved in, and I wanted to discuss our surge protection services. Old houses like this, well, they can be unpredictable with their electrical systems. I dealt with enough door-to-door salespeople to know the routine. Polite but firm rejection, close the door, move on with life. But as I started to decline his offer, something happened that made my skin crawl with a familiarity I couldn't place. The chandelier flickered. Not the random flutter of unstable voltage, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short pulses, pause, 3 more, pause, 3 long ones. The same rhythm I tap with my index finger when I'm thinking through a problem. The same unconscious beat I'd been tapping against my thigh just moments before the doorbell rang. Mitchell kept talking about voltage fluctuations and protective devices, but his words became background noise as I stared at the light fixture. The pattern repeated, my pattern, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach like swallowed ice. I managed to close the door on Mitchell's persistent pitch, but the chandelier's message lingered. I stood in the hallway, finger unconsciously tapping that familiar rhythm against my leg, and watched the light respond in perfect synchronization. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 tap. The crystal tears caught each pulse like frozen applause. That night I lay in bed convincing myself it was coincidence. Old wiring, fluctuating power grid, stress from the move manifesting in pattern recognition where none existed. The rational explanations felt thin, like tissue paper stretched over something much larger and darker, but I clung to them anyway. The doors started 2 days later. I'd fallen into a routine of working late in the home office, a converted bedroom at the back of the house. The space felt right somehow, positioned where I could see both the backyard and the hallway leading to the front of the house. I'd be deep in spreadsheets or reports when I'd hear it, the soft whisper of a door opening somewhere in the house. At first, I assumed it was settling, thermal expansion, any of a dozen mundane causes. But the sound was too purposeful, too regular, and it always happened twice. Never once, never 3 times. Always exactly twice, like someone knocking politely, asking permission to enter. I'd investigate, flashlight in hand, checking every door in the house. They were all properly closed, latches engaged, no sign of disturbance. But the sound persisted, night after night, always the same courteous double opening and closing, always from somewhere just out of sight. The 3rd week brought the electrician. Jerry Kowalski looked like he'd been fixing things since the invention of electricity itself. His hands were permanently stained with wire nuts and electrical tape, and he approached my problem with the methodical patience of someone who'd seen every possible way current could misbehave. "Heard you're having some issues with flickering lights," he said, setting his toolbox down in the dining room directly under the chandelier. I'd called him after the light show had begun, responding not just to my finger tapping but to my thoughts. I'd be reading, thinking through a complex work problem, and the chandelier would pulse in rhythm with my mental processes. 3 quick flashes when I reached a conclusion, long, steady illumination when I was processing information, rapid strobing when I felt frustrated or stuck. Jerry spent 2 hours examining every inch of the electrical system. He checked the main panel, traced circuits, tested outlets, and scrutinized connections with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. His multimeter beeped and buzzed as he worked, occasionally muttering technical observations I didn't understand. "Well, I'll tell you what," he said finally, packing his tools. "Your electrical system is in better shape than most houses half this age. Every connection is solid, every wire properly rated, every breaker functioning perfectly. Whoever did the work here knew what they were doing." He paused, looking at the chandelier with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Strange thing, though. Everything's too clean. Electrical components accumulate dust, oxidation, general wear over time. But your stuff looks like it was installed yesterday, even though some of these fixtures are clearly original to the house. Can't explain that one." After he left, I sat in the dining room staring at the chandelier. It hung perfectly still, innocent as cut crystal, giving no hint of the impossible performances it had been staging for my benefit. I found myself thinking about the implications of Jerry's assessment, about systems that maintained themselves, about houses that might be more than the sum of their architectural parts. The chandelier pulsed once, a brief wink of acknowledgement, and I felt my grip on rational explanation slip another notch. The microwave incident happened during my 4th week, and it shattered whatever remained of my ability to dismiss the house's behavior as coincidence. I'd been considering breaking the lease. The job wasn't working out as expected. Ohio felt alien and uncomfortable, and the house's increasing responsiveness to my presence was beginning to affect my sleep. I'd found myself lying awake, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in air pressure, every subtle change in the quality of darkness around me. I was in the kitchen, making my morning coffee and mentally calculating early termination fees, when the microwave began to beep. Not the normal completion signal. This was different. Single, deliberate beeps at precise intervals, perfectly timed to match the rhythm of my internal countdown. 5 minutes until my coffee was ready. Beep. 4 minutes. Beep. 3 minutes. Beep. I checked the microwave's display, but it was dark, unplugged from the wall. Yet the beeping continued, emanating from somewhere inside the device, keeping perfect time with my mental chronometer. When I reached for the plug to confirm it wasn't connected, the beeping stopped abruptly, as if the house realized it had revealed too much. That's when I understood the terrible truth that had been building like pressure behind my eyes for weeks. The house was learning from me, not just responding to my physical actions, but somehow accessing the deeper patterns of my consciousness. My habit of mental timekeeping, my unconscious finger tapping, my tendency to think in structured sequences. All of it was being observed, cataloged, and reflected back to me through the house's electrical systems. I began testing my theory with the desperate methodical approach of someone who hopes to be proven wrong. I'd think specific patterns while watching for responses. Complex mathematical sequences would trigger corresponding flashes from the overhead lights. When I mentally recited poetry, the house would pulse along with the meter and rhythm. Most disturbingly, emotional states seemed to affect the entire electrical grid. Anger would cause lights to burn brighter. Sadness would dim them to barely perceptible glows. Fear would make them strobe erratically. The house wasn't just inhabited by my presence. It was being inhabited by my consciousness itself. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the house's attention settling over me like a weighted blanket, suffocating in its intimacy. The electrical hum that exists in every modern home became a lullaby I couldn't escape, a constant reminder that something was listening to the frequency of my thoughts. I tried staying in hotels, but the pull back to Maple Street was overwhelming. Not because I wanted to return, but because leaving felt like abandoning a part of myself. The house had become an extension of my nervous system, and distance from it created a phantom limb sensation that was almost unbearable. During my 5th week, I realized I wasn't alone in my experience. Mrs. Chen returned for a property inspection, though I suspected her real purpose was to check on my mental state. She moved through the house with the careful deliberation of someone navigating a minefield, her eyes constantly shifting to the light fixtures and electrical outlets. The previous tenant, she said carefully, not quite meeting my gaze, mentioned some unusual electrical behavior. I hope you haven't experienced anything similar. I wanted to tell her everything, about the responsive lights, the courteous doors, the learning microwave, the growing sense that the house was developing an increasingly sophisticated model of my consciousness. Instead, I found myself minimizing, deflecting, protecting the house's secrets as if they were my own. Just the usual old house quirks, I heard myself saying, though part of me was screaming for help. She nodded, but her relief was palpable. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the front door, her hand resting on the frame like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. Some houses, she said softly, they get lonely. They start reaching out in whatever way they can. The important thing is knowing when to reach back and when to pull away. That night I sat in the dining room conducting my own experiment in communication. I began tapping out Morse code against the table. Simple messages at first, just my name, then gradually more complex thoughts and questions. The chandelier responded immediately, translating my tapped patterns into light with perfect accuracy. What followed was the most terrifying conversation of my life. I asked if the house was aware and received a complex pattern of long and short flashes that I interpreted as affirmation. I asked if it was lonely, and the entire room dimmed to almost nothing before gradually brightening, a response that felt more like a sob than an answer. Then I asked the question that had been growing in my mind like a tumor. Are you learning from me, or am I becoming you? The silence that followed was absolute. Every electrical device in the house went dark simultaneously, creating a void of absence that was more disturbing than any supernatural manifestation could have been. In that darkness, I felt the weight of an intelligence considering my question, processing implications I couldn't fathom. When the lights returned, they did so slowly, tentatively, like someone choosing their words carefully. The chandelier began a pattern more complex than anything I'd seen before. Rapid sequences of long and short pulses that seemed to contain layers of meaning I couldn't decode. But I understood the essential message. The house wasn't just learning from me anymore. We were learning from each other. Over the following days, I began to notice changes in my own behavior that mirrored the house's patterns. I found myself opening and closing doors twice, unconsciously matching the house's polite rhythm. My sleep cycle shifted to align with the house's most active electrical periods. I developed an intuitive sense of when appliances needed attention, as if I could feel their electrical hunger directly. Most disturbing was the growing synchronization between my thoughts and the house's responses. The lag time between my mental processes and the corresponding light patterns decreased until they were essentially simultaneous. I would think, and the house would illuminate my thoughts almost before I was fully conscious of them myself. The boundary between observer and observed was dissolving. I tried to document everything, filling notebooks with observations and theories, but the words felt inadequate. How do you describe the sensation of your consciousness expanding beyond the borders of your skull? How do you explain the comfort of being understood so completely by something that shouldn't understand anything at all? The house began anticipating my needs with uncanny accuracy. Coffee would start brewing moments before I realized I wanted it. The temperature would adjust before I felt too warm or cold. Lights would illuminate rooms I was about to enter, guiding my movement through the space with maternal consideration. It should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like coming home in a way I'd never experienced before. The house wasn't imprisoning me. It was embracing me, incorporating me into its electrical nervous system, with a gentleness that felt almost loving. That's when I understood the real horror of my situation. I wasn't afraid of the house anymore. I was afraid of leaving it. Now, as I write this final entry in my journal, the lights are pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I can feel the house's contentment settling around me like warm honey. Mrs. Chen will come for another inspection soon, and she'll find what she's probably found before, a tenant who's learned to live in harmony with something that defies explanation. The chandelier flickers 3 times, and I find myself smiling. It's saying goodbye, or hello, or perhaps something more complex that exists in the space between human language and electrical current. I understand now why the previous tenant left so abruptly, and why the house feels so lonely. They couldn't accept what was being offered, not just shelter, but genuine connection with something vast and patient and alien. They chose the safety of separation over the terrible intimacy of being truly known. I'm making a different choice. Tomorrow, I'll call Mrs. Chen and sign a long-term lease. I'll tell her the house and I have reached an understanding, which is true enough. What I won't tell her is that I'm no longer entirely sure where the house ends, and I begin, or whether that distinction ever mattered as much as I thought it did. The microwave beeps once, a gentle reminder that my tea is ready. I'm home. Story 11. The first thing you need to understand about Riverside High is that it shouldn't exist anymore. Not in any meaningful way. The state condemned it 3 years ago after the ceiling collapsed in the West Wing, and nature has been steadily reclaiming what bureaucracy abandoned. But there it stands, a hulking brick monument to educational dreams turned to dust, and somehow it still draws people like me. People with cameras and too much curiosity for their own good. I told myself we were there for the documentary. Jake and I had been working on a project about abandoned buildings across the Midwest, and Riverside represented the perfect centerpiece. A small-town school that had served the community for nearly a century before budget cuts and declining enrollment sealed its fate. The locals we'd interviewed spoke about it with a mixture of nostalgia and unease, their stories peppered with half-finished sentences and glances toward the empty windows that stared back from across the cornfields. The security chain around the front entrance had been cut long before our arrival, leaving rusted links scattered across the concrete steps like broken promises. We'd planned to arrive at noon, when the October sun would provide the best natural lighting, but equipment delays had pushed our schedule back to late afternoon. The shadows were already growing long by the time we shouldered our gear and approached the main doors. The hinges screamed as we entered, a sound that echoed through the empty hallways and seemed to announce our presence to whatever ghosts might be listening. The air inside carried the weight of abandonment, dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, the lingering scent of old textbooks and industrial cleaner somehow still clinging to the walls after all this time. Our footsteps sounded impossibly loud against the polished concrete floors, each step creating a percussion that bounced off lockers standing like metal tombstones in the dim corridors. We moved methodically through the building, Jake handling the main camera while I managed sound and secondary shots. The classrooms told their own stories, desks arranged in neat rows as if students might return at any moment, whiteboards still bearing the faint ghosts of final lessons, bulletin boards where motivational posters curled at the edges like dying leaves. Everything felt frozen in time, preserved in that particular limbo reserved for places that people simply stopped visiting. It was in the administrative wing that we first noticed the electrical irregularities. Jake had tried several wall switches out of curiosity, testing whether any circuits might still be live. Nothing responded until we reached the gymnasium corridor, where a single emergency light fixture buzzed to life with a harsh fluorescent flicker. We paused, cameras recording, as Jake tested the switch again. The light remained stubbornly off, the emergency fixture continuing its intermittent glow as if operating on some autonomous system we couldn't comprehend. The gymnasium itself was a cathedral of shadows. High windows allowed slanted beams of dying sunlight to illuminate patches of the hardwood floor, while the bleachers rose like stairs to nowhere on either side. Our voices took on a hollow quality in the vast space, each word stretching and distorting before being swallowed by the acoustic tiles above. The basketball hoops hung like gallows against the far walls, their nets long since removed or rotted away. We spent nearly an hour in that space, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the way our movements created new patterns of brightness and darkness across the court. Jake positioned himself near center court while I worked the perimeter, documenting the angles and atmosphere that would later become crucial elements of our narrative. The emergency lights in the corridor outside continued their irregular dance, flickering on and off in a sequence that seemed almost rhythmic, almost purposeful. It was when we decided to leave that things shifted from merely strange to genuinely unsettling. The exit door that had opened easily upon our arrival now resisted Jake's attempts to push it open. He applied his shoulder to the panic bar, his face reddening with effort, while I added my weight to his. The door held fast, as if someone on the other side was pulling it closed with equal determination. For long seconds we struggled, our breathing becoming labored, the sound harsh in the empty corridor. Then, with a suddenness that sent us both stumbling backward, the door gave way completely. We spilled through the opening into the fading daylight, our equilibrium shattered, ears ringing with the aftermath of resistance. From somewhere in the building's depths came the sound of metal striking concrete, a crash that reverberated through the empty halls like a period at the end of a sentence we hadn't meant to write. We should have left it there, should have packed our equipment, driven back to Chicago, and edited what we had into something presentable. But Jake was already theorizing about air pressure differentials and settling foundations, rational explanations that made perfect sense in the safety of natural light. We agreed to return the following weekend with additional equipment, determined to capture whatever acoustic anomalies might be creating these effects. The drive home was quiet, filled with the kind of contemplative silence that follows intense creative sessions. But that night, reviewing our footage in my apartment, we discovered something that challenged every reasonable explanation we'd constructed. Between the audio tracks of our voices and the ambient sound of the empty building was a third layer, subtle but undeniably present. Footsteps. The distinctive squeak of rubber soles against waxed hardwood, moving in patterns that followed no route we had taken. Jake insisted it was audio bleed from neighboring tracks, some technical glitch in our recording equipment. He spent hours with the editing software, isolating frequencies and analyzing waveforms, but the sounds remained stubbornly distinct. Worse, when we mapped the acoustic signatures against our visual footage, the footsteps seemed to originate from areas where neither of us had been standing. They traced paths around the gymnasium, maintaining a consistent distance from our recorded positions, as if something had been paralleling our movements while remaining carefully out of sight. Sleep became elusive over the following days. I found myself replaying the footage obsessively, headphones clamped tight against my ears as I tried to parse meaning from the sounds that shouldn't exist. The footsteps had a weight to them, a deliberate quality that suggested purpose rather than random noise. They paused when we paused, moved when we moved, but always remained separate, always stayed just beyond the reach of our camera's field of view. Jake's rational explanations became increasingly strained. He suggested everything from settling pipes to small animals, but his voice carried less conviction with each theory. I could see the doubt creeping into his expressions, the same questions that were keeping me awake beginning to erode his certainty. We both knew we had to return. The second visit came 3 months later, in the dead of winter. Snow had drifted against the school's exterior walls, creating sculpted barriers that made the building appear even more isolated from the world of the living. The interior temperature was barely above freezing, our breath forming clouds that dissipated slowly in the still air. We brought different equipment this time, more sensitive microphones, thermal cameras, Anything that might help us document whatever was creating these phenomena. The emergency lights in the gymnasium corridor remained active, their irregular pulsing unchanged since our first visit. We documented their behavior more carefully this time, timing the intervals, searching for patterns that might suggest a failing electrical system. But as we worked our way deeper into the building, a more disturbing discovery awaited us. In the gymnasium, pressed into a thin layer of dust that had settled across the hardwood, were footprints. Not the heavy tread marks of work boots or the casual impressions of sneakers, but the distinctive herringbone pattern of athletic shoes, basketball shoes specifically. They traced paths across the court in routes that exactly matched the audio signatures from our earlier recording. I knelt beside one particularly clear impression, my hands shaking as I held the measuring tape. The prints were fresh, or at least fresher than anything else in the building. No dust had accumulated within the treads, no signs of age or weathering. They simply existed, pressed into the floor as if someone had walked this route within hours of our arrival. Jake's face had gone pale, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck as he followed the trail with his eyes. The footprints moved in a circuit around the gymnasium, always maintaining that same careful distance from where we had positioned ourselves months earlier. They approached the center court, circled it, then retreated to the shadows beneath the bleachers before emerging again near the far wall. It was a pattern of observation, of surveillance, as if something had been studying us while we worked. We followed the trail, documenting each print, measuring distances and angles. The pattern never deviated, never showed signs of haste or random wandering. These weren't the marks of an intruder or vandal who had discovered our footage and decided to play an elaborate prank. They were too precise, too purposeful, too perfectly aligned with events that no one else should have known about. As the winter light faded outside, we found ourselves working by the glow of our equipment lights, the gymnasium taking on an increasingly oppressive atmosphere. The emergency lights in the corridor continued their steady rhythm, but now they seemed less like electrical malfunction and more like a heartbeat, a sign of some persistent life within the building's supposedly dead systems. It was Jake who first noticed that the footprints didn't end at the gymnasium walls. They continued into the corridor, following the same route we had taken during our exit 3 months earlier. They led directly to the door that had resisted our departure, where they stopped in a cluster of overlapping impressions. Someone, or something, had stood there for an extended period, waiting. The panic that had been building throughout the day finally crested. We gathered our equipment with shaking hands, avoiding eye contact as we prepared to leave. The rational part of my mind still insisted there had to be an explanation, some sequence of events that would render these discoveries mundane. But that voice was growing weaker, drowned out by a growing certainty that we had stumbled into something that operated by rules we didn't understand. The exit door opened easily this time, but as we stepped into the frozen air outside, the sound of metal against concrete echoed from within the building once again. This time it was different. Not a single crash, but a series of impacts, as if multiple objects were toppling in sequence. We didn't look back, didn't attempt to investigate. We simply loaded our equipment and drove away, leaving Riverside High to its ghosts and shadows. The footage from that second visit sits on my hard drive, untouched and unedited. Jake stopped returning my calls weeks ago, and when I finally drove to his apartment, his roommate informed me that he'd taken a sudden job offer in another state. He'd left no forwarding address, no explanation beyond a mumbled comment about needing to get away from the city. I've tried to convince myself that Jake's departure was coincidental, that the stress of graduate school and financial pressures had simply reached a breaking point. But late at night, when sleep refuses to come, I find myself remembering the look in his eyes during those final hours in the gymnasium. It was the expression of someone who had seen something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the world works. The documentary remains unfinished, a collection of files and fragments that I can't bring myself to either complete or delete. Sometimes I consider returning one more time, bringing different equipment, perhaps other people who might provide alternative perspectives on what we recorded. But then I remember those footprints, so precisely placed, so deliberately positioned, and I understand that whatever waits in Riverside High has already seen enough. There are nights when I dream about basketball shoes squeaking against waxed hardwood, about emergency lights pulsing in empty corridors like electronic prayers. In these dreams, I'm always walking through the gymnasium alone, my footsteps echoing in the vast space while other sounds, parallel sounds, keep perfect pace beside me. I wake up searching for rational explanations, for ways to classify these experiences as products of stress or imagination. But the evidence remains, stored in digital files that refuse to corrupt or disappear. The footsteps that follow, the doors that resist, the lights that pulse with artificial life in a building that should be completely dead. Somewhere in Illinois, Riverside High continues its patient vigil, waiting for the next curious filmmakers to discover that some places refuse to remain abandoned. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if those footprints in the dust were ever meant to be warnings or invitations. Story 12. The fluorescent lights in the last car of the Red Line flickered with a sickly rhythm as the train lurched through the November darkness above Chicago's streets. I should have taken an earlier train, should have left the office before 10:30, but deadlines don't care about the city's unspoken rules about riding the L after dark. The car was nearly empty, just me, the metallic smell of old rain, and the persistent squeal of brakes that seemed to follow me no matter which seat I chose. That's when I noticed them. Two men in identical gray coveralls stood at the far end of the car, positioned on either side of what appeared to be a department store mannequin. The figure was draped in thick plastic sheeting, the kind used for construction tarps, and they were pushing it between them in a slow, deliberate motion. Back and forth, like some grotesque pendulum marking time to a rhythm that had nothing to do with the train's movement. The plastic covering inflated and deflated with each push, creating a sound like labored breathing that somehow carried over the train's mechanical symphony. I found myself counting the intervals. 3 seconds of expansion, 2 seconds of collapse. Repeat. The pattern never varied, never matched the train's swaying or the irregular jolts when we hit rough track. I shifted in my seat, trying to get a better angle, trying to understand what I was seeing. The mannequin's head lolled forward, obscured by the plastic, but something about its posture suggested weight, suggested substance that plastic and fiberglass shouldn't possess. One of the men, tall, thin, with graying temples, caught me staring and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His companion, shorter and broader, never looked up from his methodical pushing. The train shuddered to a stop at Fullerton, and the hydraulic hiss of opening doors filled the silence. A cleaning worker stepped aboard, wheeling a cart loaded with mops and industrial-grade disinfectant. He was maybe 60, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades mopping up the city's mess, and he surveyed the car with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen everything the L had to offer. His gaze swept past the two men with their covered mannequin, lingered on me for a moment, then shifted upward. Almost imperceptibly, he pointed toward the ceiling. I followed his gesture and saw the black dome of a security camera mounted directly above my seat, its red recording light steady and unwavering. The cleaning worker's eyes met mine again, and he gave the slightest shake of his head before stepping back onto the platform. The doors closed with their familiar pneumatic sigh, and we lurched back into motion. I looked back toward the mannequin. The plastic sheeting had shifted during the stop, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw the outline of a face pressed against the inner surface of the tarp. Not the smooth, featureless plane of molded plastic, but the irregular contours of human features. The depression where eyes might be seen to track toward me before one of the men adjusted the covering with practiced efficiency. The train continued north, past Belmont, past Addison, carrying us through neighborhoods where porch lights created isolated pools of warmth against the urban night. At each stop, more passengers departed until only the four of us remained. Me, the two men, and their burden. The rhythmic pushing never ceased, never varied, that artificial breathing sound following us through the darkness like a mechanical ghost. At Sheridan, something changed. The train's lights dimmed momentarily, and in that brief twilight, I could have sworn the mannequin turned its head toward the window. Not the jerky rotation of a figure being manipulated, but a smooth, deliberate movement. The plastic covering pressed tight against what should have been a blank face, creating the impression of features straining against their covering. When the lights returned to full strength, Everything was as it had been. The two men continued their endless motion. The plastic continued its hypnotic inflation and deflation, and I began to wonder if fatigue was playing tricks with my perception. The final station, Howard, approached with a grinding of steel on steel that seemed to echo longer than usual. The platform lights were dark, leaving only the train's interior illumination to push back against the November night. As we rolled to a stop, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The last stop sign on the platform was dark, but its reflection in the window beside me flashed 3 times in succession, bright red letters appearing and disappearing in the glass like some kind of warning. I turned to look at the actual sign. Dark, lifeless, just weathered metal and dead bulbs. But in my peripheral vision, the reflection continued its urgent blinking. The two men gathered their burden and moved toward the exit. As they passed my seat, the taller one leaned down and spoke in a voice like sandpaper on wood. "Don't trust what you see." Then they were gone, disappeared into the darkness beyond the platform, leaving only the lingering smell of industrial disinfectant and something else. Something organic and warm that had no business being there. I rode the train back downtown in a car that seemed too bright, too empty, too normal. But sleep that night brought no relief. Only dreams of plastic sheeting that breathed with purpose and mannequins that watched through borrowed eyes. The next morning, I did what any reasonable person would do in the age of digital surveillance. I went online and found the CTA's public camera feeds. The red line cameras are accessible through the city's transparency initiative, archived footage available for 48 hours before being automatically deleted. I found the previous night's recording and scrolled to the timestamp when I'd boarded at Clark and Division. There I was, entering the last car, choosing a seat, settling in for the ride north. But when I reached the portion where the two men should have appeared with their mannequin, the feed dissolved into static. Not just visual noise, but complete signal failure that lasted exactly 17 minutes, from Fullerton to Howard and back. When the image cleared, I was alone in the car, staring at an empty space where the mannequin had been. I checked the other cameras, the platform feeds, the station overviews. Nothing. No record of two men in gray coveralls, no evidence of any mannequin, covered or otherwise. According to the city's digital eyes, I had taken a perfectly ordinary late-night train ride, alone with my imagination and the fluorescent lights. But I remembered the cleaning worker's gesture, his knowing look, his subtle warning about the camera above my seat. I searched the archived feeds for his image and found him entering at Fullerton, just as I remembered. But in the official record, he never looked at me, never pointed, never shook his head. He simply wheeled his cart aboard, performed a routine cleaning, and departed at the next stop. That should have been the end of it. Case closed, mystery solved. Exhaustion and late-night paranoia had conjured phantoms from flickering lights and an overactive imagination. I had a rational explanation, video evidence of my solitude, and a good story to share over drinks with friends who would laugh knowingly about the strange things that seem real when you're tired and alone on public transportation. But rational explanations have a way of dissolving when you're forced to take the same route night after night. My work schedule didn't change. The late meetings continued, the evening deadlines persisted, and I found myself on the Red Line's last car more often than I cared to admit. Each trip north became an exercise in hypervigilance, my eyes scanning every passenger, every shadow, every reflection in the darkened windows. For a week, nothing happened. Normal commuters riding normal trains through normal November nights. I began to relax, to accept that I had experienced nothing more than fatigue-induced hallucination brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. Then, on a Thursday, that felt identical to every other Thursday, I saw the cleaning worker again. He boarded at Fullerton just as before, but this time he made no pretense of routine maintenance. His eyes found mine immediately, and he walked directly to my seat with the measured pace of someone who had something important to communicate. He stood in the aisle beside me, close enough that I could smell the industrial soap on his coveralls and see the network of fine lines that mapped his weathered face. "You saw them," he said, and it wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Camera went dark for you too, didn't it? Another nod. He reached into his chest pocket and withdrew a small notepad, the kind maintenance workers use to log repairs and incidents. He flipped through several pages covered in cramped handwriting before stopping at an entry near the back. November 7th, 2019, he read aloud. 2 men, gray coveralls, mannequin covered in plastic, camera malfunction, Fullerton to Howard, 17 minutes. He looked up at me. November 15th, 2020, same thing. April 3rd, 2021, August 19th, 2022. He closed the notepad. Always the last car, always the same route, always the same 17-minute gap. What are they? I managed to ask. He shrugged with the resignation of someone who had long ago stopped expecting answers to impossible questions. Don't know, don't want to know. But every few months someone sees them, and every time the cameras fail in exactly the same way. Have you reported it? He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. To who? Transit authority? Police? Excuse me, officer, but I think there might be something supernatural happening on the L, and my only evidence is a pattern of technical difficulties and the testimonies of tired commuters who were probably hallucinating. The train began to slow for the next station, and he moved toward the doors. My advice, he said without turning around, take a different route, drive, walk, call a cab, but don't take this train after 10 o'clock and don't sit in that seat. Why that seat specifically? He paused at the threshold as the doors slid open. Because that's where she used to sit. She. But he was gone, swallowed by the platform's fluorescent anonymity, leaving me alone with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that my late-night encounters were far from over. I researched. Of course I researched. In the age of internet archives and digitized newspaper morgues, every tragedy leaves a digital footprint. Every mystery generates its own constellation of theories and speculation. I searched for accidents on the Red Line, disappearances, unexplained incidents involving mannequins or covered figures. What I found was worse than a specific tragedy. I found a pattern. Database searches revealed a cluster of missing persons reports dating back 15 years, all connected by the thinnest of threads. Different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being on the L late at night. But each had last been seen boarding the Red Line's northbound last car after 10 p.m., and each had vanished without a trace somewhere between Fullerton and Howard. The official explanations varied. Runaway teenagers, domestic violence victims seeking new lives, mentally ill individuals who had simply wandered off into the urban maze, reasonable explanations for reasonable disappearances, filed away in reasonable bureaucratic boxes and forgotten by everyone except families who never stopped hoping for answers. But the dates troubled me. They formed no clear pattern, followed no predictable schedule. Sometimes months would pass between incidents, sometimes years. The only constant was the route, the time, and the last car. I printed out the reports and spread them across my kitchen table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that refused to form a coherent image. Sarah Chen, 34, marketing executive, last seen October 2019. Marcus Rodriguez, 28, graduate student, disappeared March 2020. Jennifer Walsh, 42, nurse returning from a double shift, vanished August 2021. Faces stared up at me from photocopied missing person flyers. Ordinary people who had made the same choice I made every night. The last car, the late train, the assumption that public transportation was safer than the alternatives. I started taking different routes home. The brown line to the red line, switching at Fullerton. The purple line to Howard, then back south. Longer trips, more transfers, but anything to avoid that specific car on that specific route during those specific hours. For 3 weeks, it worked. I saw nothing unusual, experienced no camera malfunctions, encountered no mannequins that breathed under plastic sheeting. My sleep improved, my paranoia receded, and I began to convince myself that avoidance was the same as resolution. But the city has a way of forcing your hand. A December blizzard shut down half the L system, leaving only the red line running with severely limited service. I was trapped downtown by the storm, my usual routes canceled, my alternatives eliminated by weather that turned the streets into hostile territory. The last northbound train of the night was my only option for getting home, And that train had only one car running. The last car. I boarded at Clark and Division, snow still melting from my coat, and found myself in familiar territory. Flickering fluorescents, empty seats, and the growing certainty that some patterns are impossible to break. The two men were waiting at Fullerton. They entered with their burden just as before, positioning themselves at the far end of the car with mechanical precision. The plastic-covered figure between them seemed larger this time, more substantial, and the rhythmic inflation and deflation of its covering created harmonics that resonated through the car's steel frame. But something was different. This time, I wasn't alone. A woman sat 3 seats ahead of me, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her scrub suggesting a medical professional heading home from a late shift. She seemed oblivious to the two men and their burden, absorbed in something on her phone, earbuds blocking out the world. I wanted to warn her, to point out the strangeness unfolding behind us. But what could I say? Excuse me, but those men are pushing a mannequin that might not be a mannequin, and in 17 minutes the security cameras will malfunction in a way that will erase all evidence of what we're seeing. Instead, I watched. I watched as the plastic covering shifted and pressed against features that seemed increasingly human. I watched as the woman ahead of me began to turn around, drawn by some instinct or sound I couldn't identify. I watched as her expression changed from casual curiosity to something approaching recognition. She stood up, walked toward the back of the car, and as she approached the two men, they stopped their rhythmic pushing and stepped aside. The plastic-covered figure raised its head. The woman reached for the edge of the covering, and the lights went out. Not just dimmed, completely extinguished, plunging the car into absolute darkness as the train continued its journey through the Chicago night. In that blackness, I heard sounds that had no business existing. The rustle of plastic being removed, a sigh that might have been relief or resignation, and then silence so complete it seemed to have weight. When the lights returned, I was alone. No woman in scrubs, no men in coveralls, no mannequin, covered or uncovered. Just me, sitting in a car that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else. Something that reminded me of earth after rain, of places where flowers had been planted and forgotten. The cleaning worker was waiting at Howard, standing on the dark platform with his cart and his knowing expression. As I stepped off the train, he approached with the slow certainty of someone who had delivered this news before. Jennifer Walsh, he said quietly, disappeared August 2021. Nurse at Northwestern Memorial, worked the night shift, took the late train home. He paused. We wondered when she'd complete the circuit. Complete what circuit? The loop, he said, gesturing toward the train as it prepared for its return journey south. They take someone, and eventually, that someone takes someone else. Round and round, year after year, the mannequins just camouflage, something to hide what's really traveling in that car. I looked back at the train, its windows glowing against the December darkness. How long? I asked. How long what? How long before I'm on that list? How long before I'm the one under the plastic, helping them collect the next passenger? He shrugged with the fatalism of someone who had watched this cycle repeat too many times to count. Could be tomorrow, could be never. Depends on whether you keep riding the last car, whether you keep sitting in that seat. He began pushing his cart toward the service elevator. My advice hasn't changed. Find another route, drive, walk, take a cab. But whatever you do, don't let curiosity override common sense. And if I can't, if circumstances force me back on that train? He stopped at the elevator and turned back one final time. Then remember that some things are worse than being lost, he said. Some things are worse than disappearing, and some loops, once you're caught in them, never end. The elevator doors closed, leaving me alone on the platform with questions that had no answers, and the growing certainty that my choice was no choice at all. Tomorrow night, there would be another deadline, another reason to work late, another moment when the last car of the red line became my only option for getting home. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the platform, I could swear I heard the sound of plastic sheeting inflating and deflating in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, patient and persistent, and utterly inevitable. The city never sleeps, they say, but sometimes, late at night on the elevated trains that carry Chicago's dreams and nightmares through the urban darkness, sleep is the last thing you should worry about losing. Story 13. The first thing you learn about Fort Meridian is that it never sleeps, but it dreams. The second thing you learn is that some dreams seep through the cracks in the foundation, pool in forgotten corners, and wait. I arrived at the base 3 months ago, assigned to the communications unit in what they call the Old Quarter. The buildings here date back to the 1940s, their adobe walls thick enough to muffle both radio signals and screams. My quarters sit at the end of Building C, a narrow corridor that runs like a spine through the structure, connecting a dozen small rooms where junior enlisted like myself try to find rest between shifts. The corridor itself tells a story in scuff marks and water stains. Someone painted over them recently, but certain shadows refuse to be covered. About halfway down, there's a section of wall that draws the eye, not because of anything obviously wrong, but because of how aggressively normal it tries to appear. The paint there is slightly different, newer, applied with the careful thickness of someone trying to hide something permanent underneath. My first week passed unremarkably. Days melted into routine, morning formation, equipment checks, radio monitoring, evening chow. The base operated on a rhythm older than most of the soldiers serving here, a cadence that had settled into the desert like sediment. I learned the sound of boots on polished floors, the echo of voices bouncing off institutional walls, the way fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that got under your skin after too many hours. But nights were different. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was plumbing. Old buildings settle, pipes expand and contract, water finds its way through spaces it was never meant to occupy. The sound came around midnight, a rhythmic splash, splash, splash that seemed to originate from somewhere within the walls themselves, not above or below, but inside, as if the building had developed a liquid heartbeat. I mentioned it to Sergeant Martinez during morning briefing. He paused in his shuffling of papers, glanced up with eyes that had seen too many rotations in too many forgotten corners of the world, and suggested I request different quarters if the noise bothered me. But it wasn't the noise that bothered me. It was how familiar it sounded, how my body seemed to recognize a rhythm it had never heard before. The second time I encountered the figure in the corridor, I almost walked right past him. It was Thursday night, late shift ending, exhaustion weighing on my shoulders like a pack full of stones. The fluorescents had been dimmed to their emergency setting, casting everything in that peculiar yellowish light that makes shadows seem more solid than the objects that cast them. He stood near that section of wall I'd noticed before, but this time I could see why it drew attention. The man, soldier, I assumed, though I couldn't make out rank or unit insignia in the dim light, was soaked from the shoulders down. Water dripped steadily from his uniform, forming a puddle that reflected the ceiling lights in ways that hurt to look at directly. I offered a tired greeting, expecting the usual grunt of acknowledgement that passes for conversation at the end of long shifts. Instead, he turned toward me with a smile that managed to be both welcoming and completely empty. No teeth, no warmth, just the mechanical gesture of facial muscles arranged in approximately the right configuration. The air around him shimmered, not like heat rising from summer asphalt, but something denser, more deliberate. The kind of distortion you might see underwater, where light bends and reality becomes negotiable. When he moved toward the wall, his shoulders created ripples in the atmosphere itself, as if he were walking through something thicker than air. He pressed his palm against that section of newer paint, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a door. Not a door that had been painted over, but a door that existed in the space between what was and what should be. Then he was gone, not walking away, but simply absent, leaving only the scent of mineral water and the sound of something large settling into place behind the walls. I stood in that corridor for 20 minutes afterward, studying the wall, running my fingers over paint that felt warm to the touch despite the building's perpetual chill. The water puddle had vanished, leaving only a faint outline on the polished floor that could have been anything or nothing. Sleep became negotiable after that. During the day, I found myself researching the base's history. The library had files dating back to the original construction, reports written in the precise language of military bureaucracy that somehow made everything sound both official and unreal. Fort Meridian had been built around a natural spring, they explained. The original designers incorporated the water source into the base's infrastructure, creating storage systems and emergency reserves that would allow the facility to operate independently for extended periods. The reservoir system had functioned perfectly for decades until 1987, when a catastrophic failure in the main tank created extensive flooding throughout the old quarter. The official report blamed faulty seals and inadequate maintenance, but reading between the lines revealed a more complex story. Soldiers had reported strange sounds in the weeks leading up to the failure. Several personnel had requested transfers after experiencing what they described as persistent auditory disturbances and unexplained encounters with unidentified individuals. The cleanup took 6 months. The damaged tank was drained, sealed, and its access points permanently closed. According to the files, the water that flooded the corridors had been unusually difficult to remove, requiring specialized equipment and repeated treatments before the areas could be considered habitable again. No one was injured in the incident, but 3 soldiers requested immediate psychiatric evaluation in the weeks following the flooding, claiming they could no longer distinguish between their waking experiences and their dreams. The sound of rowing began on my 4th week at the base. It started as a faint rhythm, barely distinguishable from the building's normal settling sounds. But as nights passed, it grew more distinct. The creak of oarlocks, the splash of blades cutting through water, the subtle shift in pressure that comes from something large moving through liquid darkness. The sound always began around midnight and continued until dawn, following a pattern that suggested someone, or something, was circling the same route over and over again. I began timing it, mapping its duration and intensity, treating it like a radio signal that needed decoding. The pattern never varied. 47 minutes of steady rowing, 13 minutes of silence, then the cycle would begin again. I mentioned the sounds to other soldiers, carefully, casually, the way you might ask about weekend plans or sports scores. Most responded with blank stares or polite confusion. A few nodded knowingly and changed the subject with the practiced ease of people who had learned not to discuss certain topics. Private Chen, who had been at Meridian for 8 months, finally provided clarity during a smoke break behind the communications building. He spoke without looking at me, his words barely audible above the desert wind. "You're in room C14, aren't you?" I confirmed his guess, though I hadn't told him my room number. "Yeah, that's what I thought. You hear it because you're closest to where the old access point used to be. Most nights, anyway. Sometimes it gets louder, spreads further down the corridor. That's when people start requesting transfers." He stubbed out his cigarette and stood to leave, but paused as if remembering something important. "Word of advice, don't go looking for where the sound comes from. Some things are sealed up for good reasons, and some seals aren't meant to be tested. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the military doesn't train you to ignore problems. It trains you to investigate and solve them." I began staying awake during the rowing hours, listening carefully, trying to triangulate the source. The sound definitely originated from within the walls, but not from the plumbing system. It was deeper, more resonant, as if the entire building were sitting on top of a vast body of water that shouldn't exist. On Tuesday night of my 6th week, I decided to investigate the section of corridor where I'd encountered the wet soldier. Armed with a regulation flashlight and what I convinced myself was professional curiosity, I positioned myself near the mysterious wall segment and waited. The rowing sounds began precisely at midnight. Standing next to that wall, the sound became overwhelming, not louder, but more present, as if I were standing on the shore of an underground lake, watching someone paddle through water that existed in the same space I occupied, but in a different time or dimension. The wall itself began to vibrate gently, a tactile rhythm that matched the splash of invisible oars. I pressed my ear against the paint and heard something that made my understanding of reality crack like ice under pressure. Voices. Multiple voices, speaking in conversational tones, discussing things I couldn't quite make out, but that sounded remarkably ordinary. Duty schedules, weather observations, complaints about food quality, normal military chatter, except it was coming from inside a sealed wall connected to a drained reservoir that hadn't existed for decades. The wet soldier appeared while I was listening. This time I was ready for him, or thought I was. I kept my flashlight trained on the floor, watching for the puddle that preceded his arrival. When the water began to spread across the polished surface, I looked up slowly, prepared to meet whatever was walking toward me through the distorted air. He looked exactly as I remembered, uniform soaked from shoulders to boots. That empty smile, eyes that reflected light like standing water. But now I could see details that had escaped me before. His uniform was regulation, but old-style regulation, the kind worn in the late 80s. His name tape read Torres, and his rank insignia marked him as a specialist. He moved with purpose toward the wall, but this time I was close enough to see what happened when he pressed his palm against the paint. The outline of a door became visible, not as a trick of light, but as an actual opening, complete with hinges and a handle that gleamed with moisture despite the corridor's dry air. The door swung inward, revealing not the interior of a wall, but a space that shouldn't exist. A room filled with water that reflected a light source I couldn't identify. The water was perfectly clear and perfectly still, like glass that happened to be liquid. And floating just below the surface, I could see shapes that might have been furniture, equipment, or something else entirely. Torres turned back toward me before stepping through the impossible doorway. His smile widened slightly, and he gestured for me to follow. When I shook my head, he shrugged with the easy acceptance of someone who had made the same offer many times before. Then he walked through the door, into the water-filled room that existed inside a sealed wall, and the door closed behind him, leaving only smooth paint and the lingering scent of mineral water. I ran back to my quarters and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next evening, I found myself drawn back to the corridor despite every rational thought screaming against it. The rowing sounds had begun their nightly cycle, but now they seemed more urgent, more insistent. Standing near the wall, I could feel the vibrations through my boots, a rhythm that synced uncomfortably with my heartbeat. This time, I wasn't alone when Torres appeared. Two other figures emerged from the shimmering air, a woman in fatigues with staff sergeant stripes, and a man whose uniform bore the insignia of the Corps of Engineers. All three were soaked from shoulders down. All three wore that same empty smile, and all three looked at me with eyes that held depths I didn't want to measure. The engineer stepped forward first, pressing his palm against a different section of wall, revealing another door. Through this opening, I glimpsed what looked like a vast underground facility, its corridors filled with the same clear, still water. Figures moved through the liquid environment with practiced ease, conducting business, maintaining equipment, following routines that had been established decades ago and never interrupted. The staff sergeant opened her door next, revealing yet another water-filled space, this one containing what appeared to be a recreation area where soldiers played cards and watched television programs through the refracting medium. The water didn't seem to interfere with their activities. It simply existed as another element in their environment, like air or gravity. Torres opened his door last, and through it I could see the reservoir itself, a massive underground chamber where the walls curved away into darkness, and the water stretched beyond the reach of whatever light source illuminated these impossible spaces. Dozens of small boats floated on the surface, each one occupied by a figure who rowed with steady, methodical strokes, following circular routes that had no beginning and no end. All three figures extended invitations, not with words, but with gestures so clear that language would have been redundant. They were offering me a place in their world, a continuation of service in facilities that existed beyond the normal constraints of time and structural engineering. I wanted to accept. The desire hit me like a physical force, a longing so intense it felt like drowning in reverse. The water-filled rooms looked peaceful, purposeful, eternal. The figures moving through them seemed content, their duties uninterrupted by the complications of surface life. No transfers, no rotations, No uncertainty about where tomorrow might take you. Just service, forever, in spaces that existed between what was and what should be. I took a step toward Torres's door, then another. The water beyond the threshold looked inviting, warm despite its clarity. I could almost feel it surrounding me, supporting me, welcoming me into a routine that would never vary, never end, never disappoint. My hand was reaching for the doorframe when I heard footsteps echoing from the far end of the corridor. Heavy boots, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in this dimension, in this time, in this version of reality where walls were solid and water stayed where it was put. I jerked back from the threshold as Sergeant Martinez rounded the corner, flashlight beam cutting through the corridor's dim lighting. He approached with the measured pace of someone conducting a routine security check, but his eyes held the wariness of someone who had seen these particular doors before. "Evening, Specialist," he said, his voice carrying easily through air that suddenly felt normal again. "Everything secure down here?" I turned to indicate the 3 doors, the 3 figures, the impossible spaces filled with clear water and eternal service. But the corridor showed only empty walls, fresh paint, and the lingering scent of mineral water that could have been imagination. "Yes, Sergeant," I heard myself saying, "all secure." He nodded, studying the wall section with eyes that had learned to see things that weren't supposed to be there. "Good. Recommend you get some rest, Specialist. Long day tomorrow?" He walked away without looking back, but I noticed he kept his flashlight beam trained on the wall until he reached the end of the corridor. I haven't encountered the figures since that night, but the rowing sounds continue. Every night at midnight, the cycle begins. 47 minutes of steady movement through water that doesn't exist. 13 minutes of silence that feels like held breath. Then the pattern repeats until dawn. I've stopped timing it, stopped investigating it, stopped trying to understand it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be survived. But I still dream about those water-filled rooms, about the peace of eternal service, about duties that never end and never change. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I can feel myself taking that final step through Torres's door, accepting an invitation to join a rotation that began decades ago and will continue long after the surface world has forgotten that Fort Meridian ever existed. The strangest part isn't the rowing sounds or the impossible doors or the figures who shouldn't be there. The strangest part is how much I miss them when they don't appear, and how often I find myself standing in that corridor at midnight, hoping they'll extend their invitation one more time, just in case I'm ready to accept. Story 14. The salt air always made my lungs burn during the first mile, but by the time I reached the drainage section of the coastal road, everything settled into that familiar rhythm: breath, stride, heartbeat. 3 months into my deployment at the base, the evening runs had become my sanctuary, the only time when the weight of classified briefings and endless protocols lifted from my shoulders. That Tuesday night felt no different from any other. October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and the Pacific stretched endlessly to my left, waves crashing against the rocky barrier that separated the base from civilian territory. Streetlights spaced every 100 yards cast weak pools of yellow on the cracked asphalt, leaving long stretches of shadow between them. I preferred it that way. The darkness made it easier to forget I was still technically on duty, still trapped within the invisible boundaries of military life. I stopped at my usual spot near the old drainage system, a series of concrete culverts that channeled rainwater from the base down to the ocean. The grates were industrial-grade steel, weathered by decades of salt spray and neglect. Most people avoided this section. The smell of stagnant water mixed with seaweed created an unpleasant cocktail that clung to your clothes. But I found the isolation refreshing. Leaning against the metal barrier, I began my stretching routine, feeling my calves protest after the uphill climb from the harbor. The steady percussion of waves against rocks below created a white noise that usually helped clear my head. But tonight something felt different. A heaviness in the air, like the moments before a thunderstorm, though the sky remained clear. That's when I heard it. The voice came from below, muffled by concrete and metal, but unmistakably human. Adult, male, with a raspy quality that suggested years of cigarettes or maybe just the dampness of wherever he was calling from. "What time is it?" I straightened, looking around the empty road. No one. The nearest security checkpoint was half a mile back, and I hadn't passed another soul during my run. The question seemed to hang in the salt-tinged air, waiting. "9:15, I called out, feeling foolish but unable to ignore the direct query. What happened next made my skin crawl. The voice repeated my exact words back to me, same inflection, same breath pattern. But there was something else, a cough I'd given just before answering, a small throat clearing I hadn't even realized I'd done. The echo came back delayed, like hearing your own voice on a bad phone connection, but with an unsettling precision that suggested the speaker had been listening very carefully. Then came the explanation that made even less sense than the echo itself. The voice drifted up through the grate again, conversational now, as if we'd been chatting for hours instead of seconds. It mentioned living underneath because the wind couldn't reach down there, spoke of the drainage system like it was a neighborhood, described the concrete tunnels with the familiarity of someone giving directions to their own home. Curiosity overrode caution. I dropped to my knees beside the grate, trying to peer through the rusted bars into the darkness below. The smell hit me immediately, not just the expected mustiness of stagnant water and decay, but something else. Salt, yes, but mixed with something organic and wrong, like kelp left too long in tide pools. Cold air rushed up from the depths, carrying that smell directly into my lungs. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My sports watch, a military-grade GPS unit that had never failed me, suddenly went blank. The screen flickered, searching for satellites that should have been directly overhead, then displayed the dreaded message, "GPS signal lost." 12 seconds. I counted them, watching the display struggle to reconnect with the outside world while I knelt there above whatever lay beneath the base. When the signal returned, showing my exact coordinates once again, I stood and backed away from the grate like it had tried to bite me. The run back to my quarters felt different. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every sound carried further in the thin air. I kept checking my watch, confirming that GPS remained locked, that I still existed in the documented world of satellites and coordinates. That night, sleep came in fragments. I found myself listening for voices from the ventilation system, for echoes that shouldn't exist. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been some kind of acoustical trick, maybe maintenance workers in the drainage system playing pranks on the runners who passed overhead. But 3 days later, passing the same spot on my evening route, I felt it again. The asphalt vibrated beneath my feet, not the heavy rumble of vehicles or machinery, but something lighter, more deliberate, like fingers drumming on a desk, or someone tapping Morse code on metal pipes. 3 distinct impacts, spaced exactly 1 second apart. I looked at my watch. 9:15. The pattern repeated the next night, and the next. Always when I glanced at my watch, always 3 taps, always at exactly the same time I'd stopped that first evening. I began timing my runs differently, arriving at the drainage section at various times, but it didn't matter. Whenever I checked the time, whether at 8:30 or 9:45, the tapping came. It was the precision that got to me, the absolute reliability of something that shouldn't exist. I started researching the base's history, digging through records I probably shouldn't have accessed. The drainage system dated back to the 1940s, constructed during the base's expansion in World War II. Nothing unusual in the reports, standard engineering, concrete culverts designed to handle Pacific storms, connecting to a network of tunnels that stretched beneath most of the installation. But there were maintenance reports from the 1980s that caught my attention. Several entries mentioned unusual acoustics in certain sections, voices that seemed to carry further than they should, echoes that didn't match the tunnel dimensions. One report, filed by a contractor doing pipe repairs, mentioned finding personal effects in areas that should have been inaccessible. Shoes, clothing, items that appeared to have been there for years despite regular inspections. The report stopped after 1987. No explanation, just a gap in the documentation where regular maintenance logs should have continued. I found myself obsessing over details I'd never noticed before. The way sound carried differently near the drainage grates, how my watch sometimes took longer to lock onto GPS in that specific area, as if something below was interfering with the signals. The temperature variations, always colder directly above the culverts, even on warm nights. Other runners used different routes. I asked around casually, mentioning the section near the drainage system, and received responses that seemed rehearsed. Nobody stopped there anymore. Nobody could quite explain why, but they'd all found alternative paths that avoided that stretch of road entirely. The smart thing would have been to join them, to find a new route and forget about voices that echoed with impossible accuracy. Instead, I began stopping at the grate every night, conducting what I told myself were experiments but recognized as something closer to compulsion. I tried speaking at different volumes, testing whether the echo would match my intensity. It always did. I experimented with timing, waiting longer between question and answer. The delay remained constant, as if whatever was down there needed exactly those few seconds to process and repeat what it had heard. The conversations, if they could be called that, never varied much. Questions about time, comments about the wind and weather above ground, observations about the drainage system that demonstrated an intimate knowledge of its layout. But gradually I began to notice other details in the responses. References to things happening on the base that weren't public knowledge. Schedule changes, personnel movements, information that should have been classified. It was as if whatever lived beneath the concrete had been listening to everything, collecting fragments of overheard conversations and radio transmissions, building a comprehensive picture of the world above from stolen pieces of other people's lives. The realization that followed was worse than any supernatural explanation I might have imagined. What if it wasn't something supernatural at all? What if someone was actually down there, in the tunnels, surviving on rainwater and whatever supplies they could scavenge? Someone who had learned the base's routines so thoroughly they could predict when a runner would pass overhead. Someone who had been listening to classified communications for years without anyone noticing. But that didn't explain my watch. Didn't explain the impossible accuracy of the echoed coughs and inflections. Didn't explain why the GPS failed at exactly the same moment every time, as if whatever was happening below could reach through concrete and steel to interfere with satellite signals. I began documenting everything, timing the GPS losses, recording the temperature variations, measuring the exact duration of the asphalt vibrations. The data painted a picture that made no sense from any rational perspective, but the pattern was undeniable. Something was interacting with the world above ground in ways that defied both technology and physics. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, listening to sounds that might have been settling concrete or might have been footsteps in tunnels that weren't supposed to be habitable. During meetings, I caught myself checking my watch obsessively, waiting for 9:15 to arrive so I could test whether the phenomenon existed only at the drainage site or had somehow followed me into other areas of my life. The base's routine medical examinations picked up signs of stress, elevated heart rate, irregular sleep patterns. The doctor asked about deployment anxiety, suggested counseling services, prescribed mild sedatives that I took once, and then flushed down the toilet. How could I explain that my problem wasn't the stress of military life, but the growing certainty that I was losing my ability to distinguish between documented reality and something else entirely? 3 weeks after the first encounter, I made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation I developed during my military career. I was going to go down there. The drainage access points were locked, naturally, but locks could be dealt with. Security protocols existed for good reasons, but some questions demanded answers, even if those answers came with consequences. I planned the expedition for a Tuesday night, the same day of the week as my first encounter, bringing a waterproof flashlight, rope, and enough backup batteries to illuminate whatever I might find in those tunnels. But when I reached the grate that night, something had changed. The vibrations came before I even looked at my watch, stronger than ever before, rhythmic and insistent. Not 3 taps, but dozens. A continuous percussion that seemed to travel through the asphalt and up through the soles of my feet. When I knelt beside the grate, the smell was different too. Less like stagnant water and more like ozone. The sharp electrical scent that preceded lightning strikes. The voice that came from below wasn't asking for the time. Instead, it was counting, backwards from 12, in a measured cadence that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. When it reached 0, my watch went dead completely. Not just GPS loss, but total system failure. The kind of electromagnetic pulse that should have been impossible without military-grade equipment. In the sudden silence that followed, with my watch blank and the vibration ceased, I heard something else from the depths below. Not words or footsteps, but a sound like wind, moving through spaces that were much larger than any drainage system should contain. Vast, echoing spaces that stretched beyond the boundaries of the base, beyond the coastline, beyond any engineering project that appeared in the official records. I backed away from the grate without using my rope, without shining my flashlight into the darkness below. Some answers, I realized, weren't worth finding. Some questions opened doors that couldn't be closed again. My watch remained dead for the rest of the night. When it finally reset at dawn, displaying the correct time and coordinates, I was already 3 miles away, running a different route that took me inland, away from the ocean and the drainage systems, and the places where concrete and steel couldn't separate the world above from whatever moved in the spaces beneath. But even now, weeks later, using different paths and different schedules, I still feel it sometimes. The slight vibration in the ground when I check the time. The momentary loss of GPS signal that lasts exactly 12 seconds. The sensation of being listened to, of having my words measured and weighed by something that exists in the spaces between documented reality and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. I never filed a report about the incidents near the drainage system. How could I? What would I document? That I'd discovered evidence of impossible acoustics and electromagnetic anomalies that suggested either a breakdown in my own perception or the existence of something that military science wasn't equipped to catalog. Instead, I run different routes now, avoiding the coastal road entirely. I tell myself it's a preference for variety, a natural evolution of my fitness routine. But late at night, when the wind carries the sound of waves against the rocky barriers, I sometimes catch myself listening for voices that echo with impossible precision, for the rhythmic tapping that marks time in spaces where time shouldn't exist. And every evening at 9:15, no matter where I am or what I'm doing, I feel a slight vibration beneath my feet, and remember that somewhere below the surface of the documented world, something continues to count backwards from 12, waiting for the moment when GPS signals fail and the barriers between above and below dissolve entirely. The most disturbing realization isn't that I might have encountered something supernatural in those tunnels beneath the base. It's that I can no longer trust my own perception enough to know whether any of it actually happened, or whether the voice that echoed my words with such precision was nothing more than the sound of my own sanity, finally learning to mock itself with perfect, terrifying accuracy.